or 10 million pound mark revenue for a long period of time. They're family-owned businesses. A lot of them are family-owned businesses. And so they have a lot of constraints on what they can do, can't do, what they would like to do, and how they would like to grow the business. The banks, for a long period of time, did not have specific products for MSME. Getting credit was not very easy. There were limited number of banks. The state banks were taking care of things, and private sector banks came in. So it's a sector which has grown against the business. But in the last 10 to 12 years, for a long period of time, did not have specific products for MSME. I still think getting credit was not very easy. There were limited number of banks on MSME, the state banks were taking care of, by the way, from private sector banks came in. Restaurant businesses, it's a sector which has but in the last in India, 10 to 12 years, for a long period of time, did not have specific products for pharma businesses. I still think getting credit was not very easy. Gap on limited number of banks. So we funded a wide variety of companies, by the way, from private sector banks came in. High quality businesses, it's a sector which has scaled, and wherever, but there has been an opportunity given us. I'll give you one for a long period of time, does not have specific pharma businesses. There is this business side, getting credit was not very easy. Gap on limited number of banks. So we funded a wide variety of companies, by the way, from private sector banks. Again, high quality businesses, it's a sector which has scaled, just came back from engineering school, but there has been an opportunity given us. One for a long period of time, does not have specific pharma businesses. There is this business side, getting credit was not very easy. Gap on limited number of banks. So we funded a wide variety of companies, by the way, from $4 million again revenue. High quality businesses, it's a sector which has scaled, just came back from engineering, but there has been an opportunity given us. One for a long period of time, does not have specific pharma businesses. There is this business side, getting credit was not very easy. Gap on limited number of banks. So we funded a wide variety of companies, by the way, from $4 million again revenue. High quality businesses, it's a sector which has scaled, just came back from engineering, but there has been managing things. An opportunity given us. One for a long period of time, does not have specific pharma businesses. There is this business side, getting credit was not very easy. Gap on limited number of banks. So we funded a wide variety of companies, by the way, from $4 million again revenue. High quality businesses, it's a sector which has scaled, just came back from engineering, but there has been managing things.
Where there's an understanding that it's
one for a long period of time, does not have specific pharma businesses. There is this business side, getting credit was not very easy. Gap on limited number of banks. So we funded a wide variety of companies.
Entrepreneurs on those parts and outside. I feel like I'd love to get their insights from you. This because I've seen it transform.
To answer another part of Abhinav, right? So Abhinav, from investor sitting outside, MSME is a big area of focus. Why? Again, as I said, I'm not into numbers, but I do remember this number very well. That if we take a period between 2012 to 2020 answer to the 10-year another period, part of Abhinav, right? The number of, so Abhinav, from, I'm talking about investor sitting outside, between MSME 50 to 200 million dollar area of focus. Why? They were only again, as I said, I'm not into numbers, but I do remember this number very well. 200. That if we take a period between 2012 to 2000, investment went another part of Abhinav, the number of, so Abhinav, from, I'm talking about investors sitting outside, MSME 50 to 200 contributing area of focus. In my opinion, they were only about far not into numbers, but I do remember this number very well. 200. That because of few very structural 220, and I'll take this opportunity to highlight another part of one aspect, the number of which I think from, I'm talking about investors sitting everyone who is sitting in this MSME 50 to 200 India, in my opinion, why it is struggling. Of course, capital is a big reason. The quality of education in, I would say, to highlight another part of what one category number of which I think is, or category 3 institution is very the quality of education. You will get a very good talent from number 1. I would say colleges, or one category number of which I think is, or unless that institution is not the quality of education, you will get a very good talent from this one investment colleges for one when we look or get unless that is now the quality of education, the challenge very good talent from this one investment colleges the more one when we look or get unless that is now the quality of approach the challenge very good talent we have a huge space this one investment colleges the more one which lies or idea that is not is just you approach a fast challenge we have a 3 years before it was one blockchain college now it is more one which lies so this is where the key is just you approach a fast challenge we have a 3 years before it was one blockchain college now it is more one which lies so this is where the key is just you approach a fast challenge we have a 3 years before it was one blockchain college now it is more one which lies so this is where the key is just you approach a fast challenge we have a 3 years blockchain college now it is more one which lies so this is where the key is just you approach a fast challenge we have a 3 years blockchain college now it is more one which lies so this is where the key is just you approach a fast challenge we have a 3 years I'm the blockchain college now it is more one you don't follow decorum so this is where the key like fast challenge so we have a 3 years in 2000 blockchain college now it is more one you don't follow decorum so
इस ऑडियो को आप यहाँ से कम ज़्यादा करना हो वो भी आप कर सकते हो। तो यहाँ पर आप देख सकते हो OBS स्टूडियो में हमारी सारी सेटिंग हो चुकी है। जो लाइव स्ट्रीमिंग दूसरे चैनल पर चल रही है वो हमारे OBS स्टूडियो में आ चुकी है। इसके बाद यहाँ पर आप देख रहे हो ये हमारा कंट्रोल रूम है जहाँ पर हमने अपनी लाइव स्ट्रीमिंग की सारी सेटिंग हो चुकी है। जो लाइव स्ट्रीमिंग दूसरे चैनल पर चल रही है वो हमारे OBS स्टूडियो में आ चुकी है। इसके बाद यहाँ पर आप देख रहे हो ये हमारा कंट्रोल रूम है जहाँ पर हमने अपनी लाइव स्ट्रीमिंग की सारी सेटिंग हो
So when he told me this, then I told him a story. I said, Shyam, when I was in class 8th, my Sanskrit teacher, Mrs. Bhatti, these things you remember so because they told me lifeline. Then I told him a story. I said, Shyam, when I was in class 8th, marks of my Sanskrit teacher, like Mrs. little less than half marks less these than things my you remember because they were 49 and a half out of 50, I was 49. And I was fighting with my teacher that why did you give me this less marks? And she gave me a very relevant example, and I think it will help everybody, that if you serve a cup of tea, a very good of cup of tea in a dirty cup, nobody will drink. But if you give a bad tea in a beautiful cup, at least people will take first sip. So I said, now with this story, what do you want me to do? He took that he said, no, I'll go back, bring it proper one so that you can present it. So this is where, at that time, Kotak was, 2001 was MSME in that sector. So this is where I say the education and nuances of where you are doing businesses. This comes from education and experience. They're very relevant. So it gives a bit of your answer also, because I just wanted to get you a real life example, but just not sort of giving you some kind of a proverb or some kind of a statement from some big guy. So that is where I say if India has to grow, we have to focus on quality of an individual, quality of an presentation, and the content. Because light travels faster than sound, so it should look good before it reads good.
Noted.
Just to add to what Pankaj said, I think there is a change happening at the MSME level in quite a few companies and organizations where the next generation is now taking over. In a lot of traditional industry, the next generation coming in is actually much better educated than their parents and grandparents were. Not that the parents and grandparents didn't build a good business, but they come with a very different level of aspiration, and they come with, having studied overseas. In fact, I was reading the Cipla book, the big book on Cipla's story, and it's about how, the founders actually had studied in Germany, come back and established. So there is a lot of cross learnings which the next generation is coming in with, and they have an entirely different approach sometimes to doing things. Yes, they are not probably well versed with some of the regulatory and local aspects, but they put a very different layer of aspiration and a very different layer of ways of doing business, sometimes pivoting, sometimes changing the business model, sometimes opening the export market. So those are again changes which are happening at the ground level in some of these mid-sized companies. They are familiar with private equity capital, venture capital, they're open to taking it. When we started, people did not want to take venture capital. People said, why would I need venture capital? Why would I want someone sitting on my cap table? Today, there is an acceptance of taking venture capital and private equity. So a lot has changed in the mindset, which is helping these companies progress.
And even earlier on, right, if you look at the VC journey, companies are willing to bring in operating partners, they're willing to bring in advisors, they're willing to trade off equity stake for investment to be able to get that globalization of thought. So I think that's really, really important. Conscious of time, and there's a gentleman in the front row that has a question for us, so I'd like to come to you. I think if we can get you a mic, and we'll make this our last question for our panelists.
Thank you very much. I mean, I've learned so much about potatoes, coconuts, and teacups. I'm going to have to share those stories with my kids. But the question is the following. I work here in Oxford, and one of our colleagues at the start said, as a university, we've created more than 300 companies. We do about 20 new companies every year. I regularly hear from many of my friends in the US that if we want those companies to scale up, grow to 10 billion, 50 billion, 100 billion, they should shift to the US. Why should I encourage colleagues to shift companies instead of to the US, but to India or Dubai? That's the question.
From my experience, I think ease of operation is a big factor when it comes either in mind of investor or for that matter, promoter. So assuming if a company is in UK, and I think we are seeing it more often, I can assure you I'm not paid by Dubai for any promotion of Dubai. People are moving to Dubai. Why? Despite it's a very expensive place, it is ease of operation is massively in favor of business. And unfortunately, and I'm not saying that it is bad, Rome was not built in a day. It will take time for India to get to that level, and they are moving very fast. But it is not in favor of India. Right? It's a massive country. You cannot do whatever is happening in Dubai, in US, in India overnight. But if my business is looking for talent, is looking for cost advantage, no matter if ease of operation is in US, I would still do it in India. From our example, GII has a plan to take 30% of its operations to India, because cost and talent they're two very, very important points. So I think Indian business houses, Indian entrepreneurs, and Indian talent should seriously work on these things, because these two things are massively in their favor. One of the things in which I would like to be a little vocal on this platform, Indians should also work on learning one more language, whether it is German or Spanish or French or Arabic. If they learn this, I'm talking about the Indians who are in India, then you would be able to, command better premium, because today we work with a good number of French institutions. They want to have their back offices or some kind of mid offices in India, but they're not very comfortable only speaking in English for, I think UK knows better reason than I, that's why they don't feel comfortable about only English. only speaking in French. So these things, I think, ease of operation, but India today, with all the challenges, offer this talent and cost advantage. And of course, big market. So I think the case is in favor of India.
I'm going to come to Ranu for chime in on that.
Yeah, so I think the reasons you should look at India, see, there are certain technologies and areas, including GAI, I mean, where you would probably go to the US. There is an incredible amount of talent in the Silicon Valley. But US for the last 10 years has been on the height of its bull market, venture capital money, easy money, as I would like to put it. The situation might not be the same in the next 10 years. Venture capital, if it has to, if I give £1 million or $1 million to a company and say, build a product, in the US, it's going to be very hard to build that product on that money. So money goes a long distance in India, still goes a long distance in India. You could build a lot more. The companies are more efficient with capital in the initial part. And in the next phase of growth, you have to come to India. I mean, whereas Meta doing its experimentation, it's in India, right? Whereas Uber doing its new range of experimentation, it's in India. So you cannot take the market size, whereas Netflix doing its experimentation, it's in India. And where do you do experimentation when it comes to low cost offerings, right? Cheapest drugs to produce, cheapest kind of data plans so that you can, so a lot is happening which is very relevant for the developing world in India. So if ever you have any aspiration of reaching global, you cannot bypass India as the very next place. Yes, you might start with the Silicon Valley, as happens with a lot of entrepreneurs, but within a few years, they realize they have to be in India, they have to build it. Also, I want to just point out there are certain areas where you are much better off starting in India. Like for instance, payments, financial systems. Just go and look at what's happening on the ground in India in terms of, it's much more sophisticated. The transaction volumes are multiples of what's happening in the US. In fact, in certain cases, US plus China combined. So with those kind of volumes, if you want to have a story in those areas, you have nowhere to go.
Thank you. That's been very powerful, and we are...
A question and an observation, and I want to put the question out to you specifically, Ranu. The question is on valuation, and just on the observation before I ask the question, I think that India is great for applied and price-led innovation. For fundamental innovation, India is not a great place, and I can speak for that by virtue of the fact that I've started a venture cap fund and we invested in companies in India. And the reason why the United States, and to answer your question specifically, why the United States is the best place for incubation of fundamental technologies is because it's a culture that does not frown on failure. In India, you try to basically do fundamental innovation and you fail, no one's going to give you money again. That might change over time, but right now, price-led innovation, so all the stuff that you were talking about, fintech, et cetera, is all price-led. There's a big volume, but you'll never see the next generation technology in a large language model coming out of India. That's not going to happen. You're not going to find nuclear fusion issues being solved in India. That is not going to happen. And we have Professor Datta out here who's an innovation expert, and I'm sure he can speak to that. The question that I have for you now is on valuation, because, as someone who's been investing in India over the last 25 years, I keep hearing the swan song on India every 5-10 years coming out, and then there's a big disappointment. And I'm telling you, there's a big disappointment coming through when Byju's basically says it's gone bankrupt completely, and all the big sovereign funds and big private equity funds have invested in it, and that's going to create a big dampener. Right now, the equity market is trading at a multiple of 25 times. You just reverse the yield of that, the earnings yield is 4%. Does it make sense to invest in India when the return on capital is only 4%? All the capacity that has been built in India over the last 5 years or 10 years has been absorbed. So to now basically meet growth targets in India, you have to rebuild additional capacity at a high cost of capital. So
I'm going to just interject there because we are at time. Thank you for your question. Maybe just a quick 60-second response from you.
I only have one question for you. Which other market is less expensive, my friend? Which other market are you facing better earnings and growth metrics as compared to India? And So I'm not for a moment justifying that Indian valuations are not high, but I'm just saying in a relative world, we are all in an investing world which is relative. I think there is, so some of these Indian companies, for instance, have growths to show, but their multiples might be large. So you have to moderate your expectations. I want to kind of be very clear. At those valuations, you have to moderate your expectations on, but that is the world. That is relatively where India would stand. India would still be relatively better. That's my only contention.
Ranu, I'll just add one more point on Baiju thing. We evaluated the investment sitting in Dubai. We declined it. It is very much to the individual investor. I'll give you an example from this place, a company called British World. It came to us at an exorbitant valuation and they got bankrupt. The gentleman, the promoter, got the land and put the multiplier of the business on the land also. So that I'm not saying that is good or bad, but it is a responsibility of the investor to agree on that valuation or not. I don't think it is a country-specific issue. It is more the investor that what valuation they're. You take the example of WeWork. So I think from that particular point, I'm not talking about other things, but valuation, I would say, it is up to, what they say, the beauty lies in the eye of the beholder.
Very nicely said. All right. Thank you, Pankaj. Thank you, Ranu. I think we've got a lot of food for thought there from an opportunity and a perspective on your respective journeys. I think the audience does have a lot of more questions, but you are here for the rest of the day, so we will see you over the coffee break. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for that insightful session. Next up, we have another exciting panel, Driving Innovation in Healthcare and Pharmaceuticals, Expert Insights and Future Trends. Joining us is Chas Bountra, Pro Vice Chancellor for Innovation at Oxford, who advances drug discovery through open access research. We also have Christoph Tang, a Fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences, whose research on bacterial infections and vaccines is improving global health. Additionally, Arjun Sen. Can everyone please settle down? Additionally, Arjun Sen, head of the Oxford Epilepsy Research Group, focusing on epilepsy and neurological disorders. Moderating today's discussion is Jani Bola, an expert in structural biology at Oxford. Okay. Please join me in welcoming Chas Bountra, Christoph Tang, Arjun Sen, and our moderator, Jani Bola.
Yeah, anyways. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining our session on driving innovations in healthcare and pharmaceuticals. So my name is Jani Bola. I'm a Royal Society University Research Fellow working here in the biology department. So my passion is to understand how bacteria develop resistance and finding ways we can try to restore our antibiotics. So that's my passion. And as you already see, Soumitra and Priyansh already mentioned the history of Oxford in the humanity, the role it played for the past 800 years. So I think Oxford always keeps, in terms of understanding the medicine, so the groundbreaking research starting from 17th century of where William Harvey first mapped the circulatory network, and then that led on to groundbreaking discoveries in understanding the neuroscience. It is also the place where Robert Hooke first revealed the the structure of cells. So he defined the cell structures. And it is a place where penicillin and cephalosporin were developed and introduced in the market as antibiotics. And it is also the place where played a crucial role in developing artemisinin as a treatment for malaria. And the researcher here at Oxford, they pioneered the utility of using antibodies to trigger the immune response, just to stop the failure of surgeries. And in terms of, and Oxford is one of the great places where it actually brings the extraordinary talent together and pushes the boundaries in terms of both in terms of the knowledge and understanding human biology, and also how the biology changes when we have diseases. And that also led us to create some new innovations and treatment options. So just to name two. So one thing we're very famous of is Oxford knee surgery, and also having needle-free injections. And of course, Oxford has a long-standing commitment with working in collaboration with industry leaders. And one of the examples that Samit already highlighted is about what Oxford has done during COVID. So the vaccine that was created here and developed by pharma companies, and it actually saved millions of lives, almost we can say 6 to 7 million. And it's not on the same front of COVID. We all also need to appreciate the role of India that played in like getting the vaccines to all other countries. And also India is now playing a global role in developing the global scale of cheap medicine, especially the generic medicine. And now India is now considered as the pharmacy of the globe. So it really is also going through a transformative stage. And also in medicine, we have a lot of cutting edge innovations coming through. But the one key complex thing of these innovations, taking them from the idea from the bench to bedside, is very complex. And oftentimes, most of the innovations, they're not actually taken forward. It's because we don't have the access to the knowledge. So we don't know how things work exactly and how to go from innovation to implementing it. So, and especially that is very useful for India, the people where they don't have access in smaller universities or smaller sectors, or even rural areas. People do have innovative ideas, but they lack the access to understanding the overall process. So today, I'm actually fortunate to join by the leading experts. So they're starting from their innovations in their labs. They actually have taken some of these things to the bedside. It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce the panel today to you. The way that I decided to structure this discussion is to let the panel introduce themselves first, and followed by I have a few set of questions that I want to cover, and then I'll try to leave enough time for your questions. So just if you don't mind introducing me. Yes.
Yeah, good morning. My name's Chaz Bountra, and Pankaj, I don't have any stories on potatoes or teacups, I'm afraid. So my interests are in healthcare and the discovery of new medicines, and I've worked closely with my good friend Praveen Anand, who's sitting back there, a brilliant neurologist in London. But I also now help colleagues across the university translate their science, so commercialize it, create social enterprises, work with venture capitalists, work with industry, etc. So we're trying to accelerate the impact of our research. So that's what I do. So thank you.
Thank you. And Ajahn.
So good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. I confess it's a little intimidating being in this audience, not so much because of Chris and Chaz, who will introduce themselves and their skills to you. But I've been very impressed by just the people, the team who were helping me at the introduction. So there's Fazil and Ashna, and they were telling me about the companies that they have already set up whilst they look forward to their 26th birthdays. So that was quite impressive. So my background is, I'm a consultant neurologist here. I was at medical school here some little while ago now, then completed training in Oxford, London, and in Australia, and came back to Oxford about 10 years ago, and head of the Oxford Epilepsy Research Group and professor of global epilepsy. And what we do is look at epilepsy in all of its dimensions. So epilepsy is a very common condition. It affects 10 million people in India alone, but it's also a gateway to lots of other conditions. So it's a gateway to dementia. It associates very closely with stroke. It's a highly stigmatized condition. So it enables us access to all of those conditions as well. And my personal interest is looking at the intersection of epilepsy and dementia, and also then developing culturally contextualized technologies at scale to be able to deploy those into underprivileged settings. And mindful, I really liked some of the quotes in the previous panel, mindful that light does travel faster than sound, and that I should have brought a better bag to show you this. So this is my teacup, yeah? So this is an example of the kind of stuff that we've done. So this is a modular EEG headset. And what it does is it records brainwave activity. It's modular, so you can clip electrodes in and out. So if one electrode breaks, you can just replace the electrode rather than having to replace the whole headset. And it's 3D printable. So you don't actually need to take this anywhere. You just need to have a 3D printer in the location where you want to have the headset, send the code, print the headset. The new versions, because the engineers don't allow me to take the new versions out of the lab, have the wires actually running through the frame, so you don't see all of these tangled wires here, and it then connects via Bluetooth to a tablet, which can then offer a first read of the EEG. So suddenly you can take quite complex conditions and say, actually, we can do brainwave recording, we can get an algorithm to read the EEG, determine whether someone may be more or less prone to epilepsy, and start to streamline healthcare. Thank you.
Impressive. Well done. So, my name is Christoph Tang. I just want to thank the organizers and really say I'm astounded by the collection of people who've managed to get today, and I'm really pleased to be part of today's event. My interest is in bacterial infection. My group study those bacteria which are specifically carried and cause disease in humans. And so over the years of evolution, these bacteria have developed adaptations to their human host. We try in the lab to understand the interactions of bacteria with the immune system, with human cells, because we think that those interactions, which have developed highly specifically, highly evolved, are potential weak points where we can intervene with vaccines and with therapeutics. And that's the sort of translational aspect of the work that we do in the lab, is to develop vaccines and new therapies based on the understanding which we do at the bench. My interest in infectious disease goes back a number of years to the time when I was a young doctor, working for a couple of years, for 2 years in a government hospital in the Gambia, West Africa, where I saw firsthand the devastating impact of infection, malaria, TB, dysentery, respiratory diseases. It then led me from a life of being a clinician at the bedside to want to do something about it in the laboratory. So I retrained to research. An experience at the hospital at the top of the hill, John Radcliffe Hospital, where I saw a nurse die one morning from meningococcal disease, despite best care that we could offer in the hospital, despite intensive therapy, antibiotics, all sort of support, life support. This person died in front of our eyes within a few hours. I realized then that was going to be what I wanted to do for my career, was to prevent meningococcal infection. And that set me on a path to look at Neisseria meningitidis vaccines. We've now translated some of the abilities that we have with Neisseria meningitidis to Neisseria gonorrhea, which is a disease which obviously affects those in impoverished, difficult circumstances, affects female reproductive health. We also work on Shigella. So we work, which causes bacterial dysentery. So the group work essentially on diseases of poverty with those bacteria which are adapted to the human host. And through the work on Neisseria meningitis, I'm very proud to be an external consultant to the Serum Institute of India, who are currently developing our meningococcal vaccines. I also work on a scientific advisory board for biotech companies and for research institutes in Africa and Southeast Asia.
Thanks, Chris. Thank you. And yeah, and one thing that you can immediately see is what their passion is about curiosity. So they're basically curious about things and then implementing that into the practice. So I just wanted to start the discussion by what is the meaning of innovation in healthcare in a broader sense, and why that is important. So, Charles, would you like to comment on that?
So, I mean, I worry about a lot of challenges that we have currently in healthcare. You know, I worry about, for example, cancer. You know, despite many decades of investment, there are still several cancers that are virtually death sentences. So pancreatic, esophageal, ovarian, brain, they are death sentences. We desperately need more treatment. I mean, in this tiny country of ours, 68 million people, you know, in the next 12 months, 350,000 people will get diagnosed with cancer. That's 1,000 people every day. That's one person every 90 seconds. I worry a lot about dementia. You know, in this country, we've got 850,000 people with dementia. In 2050, it's estimated that will be 2.1 million people. We've got more patients than we've got carers. And all of us who live to more than 80 years of age, 1 in 6 of us will have Alzheimer's. And, you know, and we do not have any treatment that slows down the progression of that disease. We have aging societies. You know, in the next 20 years in this country, we're going to see a doubling in the number of pensioners. We're going to see the incidence of cancer go up 180%. So pensioners with cancer is going to increase by 180% in the next 20 years. So it's almost a tripling. Pensioners with diabetes will go up 120%, so more than a doubling. Mental health, massive issue before the pandemic. It's an even bigger issue now, and the incidence is just going up and up and up around anxiety, depression, substance abuse, eating disorders, etc. And it's right across the world. We don't have good treatments for mental health. Most pharmaceutical companies in the last 20 years have pulled out of that research. Antimicrobial resistance. You know, already there's 1 million people every year dying across the world because they're resistant to existing antibiotics. If we don't come up with a new generation of antibiotics, you know, it's predicted in 2050 that number will be at least 10 million. And it's not that those people are in poor developing countries. You know, some of those people dying who are resistant to antibiotics are here in the UK or Europe or North America, etc., etc. Rare diseases, you know, we've got 7,000 rare diseases. Altogether, it's 350 million people across the world. You know, 30% of those kids don't reach the age of 5, and 95% of them have no treatment whatsoever. So we've got massive challenges. And I think some of those conditions, pharma companies are not going to work on. Maybe antimicrobial resistance, maybe many of these rare diseases, etc. I think we're fortunate in a place like Oxford that we have amazing clinicians, and we have amazing clinician scientists. And now increasingly we've got amazing clinician scientists who are entrepreneurs. And you know, there's a couple sitting on our panel today, etc. And so I think what we have to do is, and even in Oxford, we can't tackle these problems on our own. We're going to have to collaborate. We're going to have to partner. So we're going to have to partner with charities. We're going to have to partner with governments. We're going to have to partner with the pharmaceutical industry. We're going to have to partner with the regulators and funders and so on and so forth. These problems are so big, and they affect the whole planet. We need to work together. and we need to work with other universities, and we also need to work with other countries. So I hope maybe after today that there is some discussion about maybe what we in Oxford could do, working with colleagues here, maybe with colleagues in India, to do something at scale. And like I said, the one thing that causes me sleepless nights at the moment is mental health. This is just absolutely frightening. And I talk to colleagues about what the causes of this increase are. I don't get hard answers. And of course, if you don't know the cause, you don't know what to do about it, etc. So I think we've got to work together. There's no time for duplication. We need innovation. We need enterprise. And so, for me, I often say to colleagues, across the world, there's millions of researchers, and they're doing great research. A lot of that research, frankly, is just incremental research. And what we need is transformative research, something step-changing, new technologies, new diagnostics, new biomarkers, new ways of doing clinical trials, etc. We need to change the way we do things. At the moment, the pharmaceutical industry, when it does discover a drug, it costs maybe $4 billion. It takes maybe 12 to 15 years. We've got to drive those costs down, and we've got to drive the times down, etc. So.
Definitely, and thank you very much for that. And in terms of the innovation in healthcare and clinical settings, would you like to comment a bit more on that?
Sure. Chaz has given a brilliant answer, and a completely that was said there. And we really need to think very differently about how we're going to approach global problems. And I would pick up on one aspect. All of those aspects, I agree, are really important. But I think aging is the next pandemic. And because populations are aging very quickly around the world, and the conditions that we now see in older age, such as dementia, cancer in older age, and so on and so forth, you can almost see that this is going to play out in countries where the populations are currently much younger. So, for example, we do a lot of work with partners in Zimbabwe. And in Zimbabwe, when HIV was ravaging the country, life expectancy dropped to 43 years. So the life expectancy was only 43. It's now up at about 65, but you will see all of those consequences of aging come through into, thankfully, life expectancy is improving, but there will be HIV-associated dementia, other dementias, and so on and so forth. And to contextualize that a little bit, so people may be familiar, aducanumab was a treatment that was developed to try and help with Alzheimer's disease. The cost of aducanumab per quality-adjusted life year, so for every quality-adjusted life year with aducanumab, the cost is nearly $1 million. The per capita spend on total healthcare in Zimbabwe is $50. So a treatment like aducanumab is never going to make a real difference to the populations that are aging so quickly. And so we do need to think out of the box, think about repurposing drugs that are relatively cheap, that you could get into low-income settings quickly. We heard in the previous panel about India as the pharmacy of the world. Well, we need to leverage from that, and actually how can we then do good? And it will do good on both sides, both on the supply side and the demand side. But I think we can see all of those conditions of aging coming in populations, including in India. You can see it coming in India. We should try and get ahead of the curve, because if we just allow the same things to happen that have happened in the UK and the US and Europe and so on and so forth, that would be a tragedy. And I do believe that if you can make this much difference for 1 million people, that's probably better than making this much difference for 10 people. That's not to withstand that you shouldn't do good for those 10 people, but at a utilitarian perspective, we need to try and have that kind of approach.
Thanks, Arjun. Yeah, really, we need to think even on a global scale. That's what Oxford is very good at. And Chris, just want to say, definitely, when collaborating with India, or there are definitely challenges involved. So I want to see the personal experience of you taking your innovation and trying to develop. I know you're developing vaccines. So would you like to share your experience of that? And then we'll see
what other challenges are there when we want to implement something?
Yeah, so my personal experience for developing the vaccine was we faced challenges early on in terms of finding partners. And I know Professor Dutta mentioned, and Jazz have mentioned, how much spin-out activity, how much entrepreneurship, how much interaction the university has with pharmaceutical industry. But sometimes the address book isn't as full as we'd like it to think it is. We don't have an address book of every possible funder, every possible supporter of research. And actually, I think in my space, in bacterial infection, maybe Annie, you could comment on this, the links between companies which are involved in antibiotic research and the University of Oxford are not huge. And so finding relevant companies is hard, and I think that's one of the major challenges that I certainly find in terms of taking things forward. The other problem we have in the vaccine space is obviously the model of vaccines, the fact that vaccines are only given on 1 or 2 occasions, and pharmaceutical companies don't see that as a very profitable way forward. Pharmaceutical companies love things which are incurable. Chronic diseases, inflammation, hypertension, high cholesterol levels. People are then hooked into therapies for years and years and years. And one-off treatments such as, or preventative interventions such as vaccines or antibiotics, again, antibiotics are sort of doomed by their own success because they're curative and their course is only for 7 days. So a company will only get 7 days of revenue for a particular therapy. And it sort of goes back to what Chaz was saying of the drivers for making antibiotics in the age and the challenges that we have for antimicrobial resistance. So in that context, it was difficult to find a partner. And it was through personal contacts of somebody I knew who worked closely with the Serum Institute of India to develop a vaccine for Africa. This was a meningitis A vaccine, it's a particular strain of meningitis. The person involved is Mark LaForce, who is a public health physician, and he had novel technology to apply to rid Africa of this disease. And he went around pharmaceutical companies in Europe, GSK, Pfizer, etc., and was told that he couldn't make this at cost for Africa. It was only when he came across Serum Institute of India was the possibility of making this at cost, and the sort of model of making large amounts of a vaccine at low prices with a very small margin to go into large populations was established. And that has essentially led to the eradication of meningitis A across Africa. It's been an amazing public health achievement. And it was through Mark who sort of introduced me to researchers at Serum Institute of India.
If I could just add maybe 2 or 3 minor comments. I mean, I think we're very lucky here in Oxford. We have such brilliant people. But we've also got a brilliant network of alumni that are spread right across the world. We have an amazing brand name. And as Sumitra said at the start, we have a culture in this university of collaborating and working together and trying to solve big problems, just like we did in the pandemic, etc. So I think that's important. The second thing I would say is that, I said mental health keeps me awake at night, but the thing that's an absolute, it's coming our way at full speed is the climate emergency. And of course, as a consequence of those climate changes, we are going to see migration on a scale we've not seen in the next few decades. We are going to see massive increases in mental health and changes in infectious diseases, etc. So these challenges are becoming more and more urgent and more pressing. The other thing I would just say related to this about healthcare, and I'm going through the agony at the moment. So my mother, who's 90, 3 weeks ago, she had a stroke. So I work full-time, my wife works full-time, she lives with us, etc. This social care thing, together with the aging, this is something that unfortunately it's going to hit all of us. And we need to sort that out, and that requires also a lot of innovation, a lot of enterprise, etc.
Can I pick up on that? Yeah. So I agree with that, and obviously we all hope your mum recovers well and quickly. And I think that's right. And I also think that we're all in Oxford and we all love Oxford, but actually Oxford does do this better than anywhere else. It is what I find going to other places, that people will always be interested in global health and that idea that you should be able to help your fellow human wherever they are. But in Oxford, it is done at a very human level. It is very altruistic. There isn't that we want a benefit in Oxford. It's actually that you want that benefit to be widely shared and disseminated. And I don't necessarily feel that in quite the same way everywhere else.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And just in terms of the innovations wise, just how do we measure is a success? Let's say somebody, when we're collaborating with somebody, so how do we measure it is a success? The innovation is a success.
Well, I think, we can have some numbers. I think Sumitra's example at the start is probably the best. You all saw what this great university did in the pandemic. We worked with AstraZeneca, we worked with the UK government, we worked with the UK regulators, we worked with funders like Wellcome and Gates. We created a vaccine in 9 months, something that would normally take 9 years. But importantly, we said, we don't want to make money out of this. We're going to give this vaccine away at cost price. That vaccine has saved more lives, as you said, 6 to 7 million lives across the planet. It saved more lives than the Pfizer vaccine or the Moderna vaccine. And, and it's interesting that our vaccine has still not been approved in the US, and of course it won't ever be approved in the US. The Pfizer vaccine, the first place it was approved was in the UK. But the one thing I would say, I don't think any other university on the planet would have done it. Harvard wouldn't have done it, Stanford wouldn't have done it, it's only Oxford. So it says a lot about the culture of this place. In terms of metrics, I can share metrics. It's easy to sort of beat your chest and share metrics, but sort of in this great university, so 3 years ago, 2021, we had 875 million of research funding. Now that was more than any other university in the country by a significant margin. That particular year, we created 31 companies. That was more than any other university on the planet. Our companies that year in 2021 pulled in 1.4 billion of VC funding. The rest of the UK did 1.2 billion. So we pulled in more VC funding than the rest of the country put together. That was 2021. In 2022, let me just share with you some successes. So Matthew Wood, one of our brilliant entrepreneurs, IPO'd one of his companies, PepGen, for 108 million. Osler raised 100 million. Carol Robinson's OMAS raised 100 million. Richard Cornell sold Miro Bio to Gilead for 405 million. A couple of students created an antibody company called DJS Antibodies, and they sold that to AbbVie for 255 million. And Nucleome raised 37 million. That was 2022. Last year, 2023, Caristo raised 16 million, Ultromix got FDA approval, and Bob McLaren, another one of our geniuses, an ophthalmic surgeon who's interested in sort of rare eye diseases and blindness, etc. He created a company called Beacon Therapeutics, and he got 96 million seed fund. That's the largest seed fund ever in Europe. So this is what's happening in Oxford at the moment. And the question I asked earlier is, so what I now worry about is, I know we can create lots of billion-pound companies, but what I'm now interested in is how do I grow them to 10, 50, 100 billion? Because that's when we really have impact. That's when we really change the world. We help lots of patients, we save lots of lives, and, frankly, what I want to do is I want to create a company, $1 trillion company in the UK. I'd like it to be in Oxford. I'm envious of Stanford. I was saying to some colleagues earlier, on the doorstep of Stanford, there's 6 companies, each worth more than $1 trillion. Apple's more than 3 trillion. Nvidia's more than 3 trillion. Microsoft's more than 3 trillion. Alphabet, Google is more than 2 trillion. Amazon's 1.8. Meta is 1. In Europe at the moment, we have no company worth $1 trillion. So you imagine if we could create something like that in Oxford. And I'm confident we can, because we've got the people, we've got the ambition, we need more funds, but we need more expertise in scaling up companies. I don't think we have enough of that expertise in the UK, and I'm looking to the US to pull that here.
Thank you, Chaz. Thank you. Chris, you want to comment on it?
I'll just say something at a very different level to what Chaz has just said in terms of what we'd see as success in innovation and in the space of entrepreneurship. And I would say the thing I would value most in the future is the people we train and the people who come through our system. Because first and foremost, Oxford is a collegiate educational institution, and we're proud of the people and the way people think here, interact in a broad sense, and tackle huge problems across the world. And I think, you know, the fact that we have PhD students putting together an event like this is just a testament to the confidence that they have, the sort of willingness to go out and establish something like this. And I think that's another aspect of, well, that's why I see a success for me. If people coming through my lab can go on and do great things, I can't solve the world problems myself now, but the next generation can. And if I can be part of the process of education and support and mentorship of next, I think we'd all feel this very, very closely. If we can contribute to that future and future success, future talent, then that would, for me, would be the thing I would be most proud of.
And for me, it's wonderful hearing those things. I feel quite inspired myself. I hope everyone else does. But actually, the thing that I also think University of Oxford does very well is bring together people who don't necessarily ordinarily work together. So, because it isn't a university that is just focused in STEM or just focused in business and so on and so forth. It is the collegiate across every discipline university. So the way I became interested in global health, just a quick anecdote, having learned about anecdotes, is that back in 2017 I got an email from someone who works in anthropology and history. And it was a very random email. It just said, hi, you know, I work on mental health disorders in Africa and the history of those disorders. And I'm thinking about moving into epilepsy. So I looked up epilepsy and your name came up. Do you want to hang out? That's the email, right? So it's the kind of email you think, well, of course, right? So let's go and see what happens. So we went to meet her. And she's now a very close friend named Sloane Mahone. And I went in she has a typical historian's office, so there are books everywhere. But she also had a visitor from Zimbabwe, and Zimbabwe is the country I was alluding to before, who is someone who has epilepsy himself. And so he was telling his story, and it's a very moving story. And all three of us got on very well. And then we were like, okay, well, why don't we actually do a project together in Zimbabwe? And Oxford has a lot of unique seed funds that you can just apply for small amounts of money to go and do work. So we thought, okay, well, look at the impact of epilepsy on marriage in Zimbabwe. And we got a grant from the Africa Oxford initiative. So it's £4,200. And so that was 7 years ago. And now the global epilepsy portfolio is just under 10 million. So it can all happen just through serendipitous connections with people who you wouldn't ordinarily work with. So the engineers who developed this headset were not actually interested in epilepsy, but what they were interested is the whole package. You know, how can we do things together? And how can you learn from the historians and the ethnographers? Because you will all know you can put tech into a space. Unless the people in that space are going to engage with the tech or the vaccine or the drug or whatever it happens to be, it will go nowhere. It will make no difference. So you have to have actually that cultural underpinning, which is what the historians and the geographers and everything bring. And so that's what I also really like, is that sort of really, really interdivisional, multidisciplinary working.
That's very key. Should we just start taking one question and then just can ask? Sorry, yeah, over there.
Thank you all for those wonderful insights. My name is Mihir Sheth. I'm a researcher at the university. And I think sort of picking up on something, Christoph, you just mentioned, was that, so I'm a research assistant at the level of a postdoc, right? And I think there is a lot of talent, curiosity, drive, and ambition in that level. But because postdocs are not part of the collegiate system, we can't access these same resources and the same serendipitous connections that you are mentioning. And especially, I think, as Pankaj and Ranu were talking about, as Indians, there is a lot of drive and ambition in us. So how can we, as Oxford, take those two and sort of try and elevate that to make more successful startups, to make more successful technology translations that otherwise don't happen, because once the postdoc leaves, a lot of the experience, the drive, the knowledge also leaves.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
So, I mean, I think you raise a great point, and it's something I do worry a lot about. I should say, sort of, you know, we're fortunate. I mean, there's Rishi Anand sitting at the back, who's an absolute genius. He did his DPhil here and just left recently, and he's now working at BCG. But you know, there are lots of student-led societies, etc., and I think that's good. But I think the one thing I would say is that, and it goes back, Christoph, to your point, in this great university, we obviously have to teach the next generation, and I think we do a brilliant job of that. We also have to be a research powerhouse and do and train the next generation of researchers. But I think you touch on something important. I think now as a university, we are expected to create impact with that research. And to do that, we need to train great leaders and great innovators and great entrepreneurs. And I think most researchers, frankly, are not leaders. And few researchers are innovators, and very few researchers are entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs are, for me, people who you put a hurdle in their way, they will get around it somehow, and they're going to prove the world wrong and they're right, etc. We need those sorts of people. And it's those sorts of people who are going to solve all these big problems.
Let's take one more question.
So first of all, thank you very much. And my question is actually all three. I'm taking points from Professor Bontra, Professor Jani, and Professor Christoph. You mentioned sleepless night because of mental health challenges. You talked about instead of doing 90% for few people, let's do 60%. I'm just putting some numbers. And you talked about the pharmaceutical, they want to do business around the chronic thing, right? So, you know, and maybe it is just I'm looking for an endorsement or using this forum to pass on the message. It's not necessarily a question. See, all these things, there's a massive problem. The gravity of the situation, I don't think can be articulated well. With this kind of massive problem and huge scarcity of resources, don't you think it is better also that let us promote preventive measure? Let us talk about also in these forums that let it be responsibility of each individual to work toward his or her health. Because if you live a reasonably well-disciplined life, the lot of things which become the responsibility either of an exchequer or an institution or an insurance company can reduce to a great extent. I'm not saying that everybody has to follow yoga or this, but I personally have seen and experiencing a huge benefit of a very good health or a good, but with a disciplined life. So don't you think that we should, and because Oxford is such a massive, great institution, I think only of its kind, should also be using or is using this. I just thought I'll use this opportunity to give my feeling about also stressing on preventive measures, just not putting after responsibility have this health issue. Please take care of it.
Arjun, do you want to comment on that?
So yes, completely agree. We need to do that. We need to have better preventative measures at scale across all disorders, that will certainly help in terms of preventing dementia, preventing the risk of stroke, potentially impact on cancer. The vaccines are preventative for preventing infections and so on and so forth, so we need to do that. I would go back one step and say that there is still work to do in that. Most people know, for example, that they shouldn't smoke. Most people who smoke know that they shouldn't smoke. Most people who drink a lot of alcohol know actually they would probably be better if they didn't drink alcohol. So what is underpinning those behaviours? And I do think, I agree with you completely, there could be a huge opportunity, both in terms of research and in terms of investment, is this sort of nudge factor. How do you move people who know they should be doing something different to actually be doing better? We all know that we probably shouldn't be drinking coffee at 10 o'clock at night. We have all drunk coffee at 10 o'clock at night, right? And if you haven't, why are you in Oxford? Because you need to be doing a lot of work, right? So how do you change that behaviour? So I agree with you 100%. And I also think that there is opportunity there in that space to try and make, again, those large differences.
And in the interest of time, we'll just have one last question. And then after that, we can have more.
My question is for you.
Oh, sorry.
So what's the most promising diagnostic marker that you've seen in the aging and dementia space most recently, say in the past 3 years? And that's in the context of the amyloid being quite a disappointment because it's probably end-stage disease.
So it's about a marker that we have seen for...
An area that there's huge interest in is plasma biomarkers. So if you can move, instead of having to do cerebrospinal fluid, so that's when you do a lumbar puncture and you sample the fluid surrounding the brain, if you can actually do a blood test to try and predict who may be at risk of dementia. There's also a lot of work, again, being led from here, looking at blood tests to try and diagnose Parkinson's disease. There is probably going to be a huge area of opportunity there. It's also the case that really simple biomarkers, such as checking blood pressure in people over the age of 50, will probably end up giving some insight into who might be at risk of neurodegenerative disorders going forwards.
Okay, yeah. In the interest of time, so I know the discussion is very stimulating and we can carry on, having long discussions. But of course, there's a coffee break now, so we can all catch up with the panel members there. And I would like to thank you all the speakers for that.
Hi guys, thank you for being the most amazing audience for the last 2 insightful sessions. We have a coffee break from now until 11:25 a.m. So please grab some refreshments that we've arranged for you in the lobby area. Please be seated back by 11:30 a.m. max, as we have many more invaluable sessions planned for you. So, welcome back, everyone. We hope everyone had a refreshing break. Next up, we have another exciting panel on Shaping Tomorrow, the Future of Mobility in India. Joining us is Sanjay Kapoor, Chairman of Sona Comstar. As a leading figure in the automotive industry, Sanjay has driven significant innovations in mobility solutions, contributing to the transformation of the transportation sector in India. We also have Professor Miles Allen, a distinguished climate scientist and professor of geosystem sciences. Miles' research on climate change and sustainable energy solutions is pivotal in addressing environmental challenges and shaping future mobility. Moderating today's session is Sandeep Bhamar, founder of Green Frontier Capital. Sandeep's expertise in sustainable investment and his commitment to green initiatives make him an ideal guide for our conversation on the future of mobility. Please join me in welcoming Sanjay Kapoor, Professor Miles Allen, and our moderator, Sandeep Bhamar.
Thanks. Can everyone hear me? Okay, perfect. So welcome, everyone. Obviously, very, very happy to have two leaders who are will be able to talk to the future of mobility and sustainability. So the questions that I've actually prepared for today are in the context of a larger sustainability theme. And Sanjay, as someone with extensive automotive industry experience, I'd like to kind of kick off this conversation with you. What role do you think emerging technologies such as electrical vehicles and automotive, autonomous vehicles have on the future of mobility?
Yeah,
especially in the context of India.
Yeah, thanks, Sandeep. So the automotive industry is highly disruptive, and it's disrupting quicker than any other industry that we're familiar with because of the kind of change that's required, not just from customers but from regulation as well. So there's a lot of regulatory change that's driving the kind of technologies that are being adopted in the automotive industry. So you talk about electrification, you talk about alternate fuels, you talk about the fact that now there's also different types of mobility. So when we look at automotive today, it's actually mobility. You look at electric VTOLs, vertical landings and takeoffs. So there's all kinds of technologies that are being adopted in automotive, and I think what we're going to see in the future is, whether people like it or not, we're going to see more EVs. I think there's a lot of debate about the kind of energy going into fuel EVs, the cost of EV, the cost of actually on the environment in building electric vehicles. There's a lot of conversation about that as well. But as far as I can see from a component industry, and that's really where we're in the component space, we're seeing disruption, which the kind of disruption we've never seen before in terms of technology, even when it comes to whether it's telematics, it's connectivity. You talk about autonomous. I think autonomous is also, level 5 is really self-drive, but everything else to get to level 5 is very, very doable and is happening even today. If you look at from the Indian context, the government is putting a lot of money behind electrification, a lot of money behind new technologies by production-linked incentive schemes. We've got PLI, which we call PLI, schemes for ACC, which is the battery technology. You've got production-linked incentive schemes for drones, for solar. Again, that goes into the fact that infrastructure needs to be green as well, as they call it. They want to have 70% of all commercial vehicles by 2030 to be EV. There's a scheme to 10,000 buses in 181 smart cities, and that's a very small number in the grand scheme of things, but everything's moving in that direction. So I think that the automotive industry, which I'm now coining as the mobility industry, is going to have to make a lot of investments. There's a lot of push for Make in India, but not just Make in India. I think Design in India is also extremely important. So a lot of push that's going to go through the supply chain to see how across the board we can adopt technologies. And I think this is a great platform. I was talking to someone earlier, and see how academia and industry can really sort of connect with each other and build something together so that we can leverage the technology and leverage the know-how, because the domain expertise lies with us. But the expertise in terms of technology is really where we need that push from academia, and I think it's a great opportunity.
So Miles, just on a more general level, how critical do you think is the role of the mobility sector in addressing climate change?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me here, and it's a great pleasure to be here. And clearly, the mobility sector, it's a large chunk of global emissions, and a growing one. As we decarbonize other easier to decarbonize sectors, it's going to become proportionately a much bigger part of the challenge. And since you were talking about, as it were, terrestrial mobility, I was going to focus on the aviation sector in particular, which is currently a pretty small part of global emissions, but rising rapidly, growing rapidly, and in a country like India, with the enormous distances that people have to cover, it's going to become an ever more significant part of the issue. And it's actually also a very topical issue closer to home for me here in Oxford, in that we in Oxford have set ourselves a goal of net zero by 2035, and at the insistence of people like myself, we were very keen that this should include all of the emissions associated with our activities, which of course, as a global university, has to include, therefore, our mobility around the world, our maintaining our role as a global university. And this is where I wanted really to, with permission, I should stress, steal a line from former Minister Sinha, who you will be hearing from shortly. The former minister mentioned to me that, Minister of State for Aviation, so clearly on top of this brief. And he mentioned to me that he likes to emphasize to people that net zero is net positive. We have to be positive about the transition to net zero. And this is an incredibly important message, particularly here in the UK, where net zero has become is rather very much to my concern, becoming a very divisive issue, not just in the UK, but in Europe, because it's seen as a negative. And I think this is particularly an issue for aviation. I mean, 2 or 3 years ago, we had the whole flight shaming movement, and people being told that it's sort of wrong to fly. And I think we need to move beyond that. And I suspect, as a former Minister of Civil Aviation, you would agree with me on this, although I've been looking forward to hearing what you have to say on it. Yeah, fair enough. And we're delighted to have you here. And it's essential that you can. And it's essential that people can travel around the world and come to Oxford to mix with people from all over the world. I mean, this is the glue that keeps our planet together. So it's so important that we maintain that. But we recognize, therefore, in Oxford, many of our students and young people are increasingly sort of anxious about their environmental impact, anxious about the impact of flying. So we need to address it. And we need to work with the aviation industry to work on long-term solutions. And this is where I think, in contrast to the terrestrial automotive industry, if I might frame it that, the aviation industry right now builds, planes are built, you were mentioning how fast the automotive industry can change. Cars don't last very long. Whereas airframe design lasts for decades. You can't change your aviation fleet very quickly. It's even harder, for example, to change the refueling practices in airports, because you've got to literally close down the airport and rebuild it if you wanted to switch to fueling planes on hydrogen and so on. So one thing I think we can be sure about, definitely past 2035, which is when Oxford has a net zero target, and probably well past 2050, we will be flying planes on kerosene. We have to accept that fact. Maybe not all planes, there are interesting developments in electrification of short-haul transport, but long-haul transport will be fueled on fossil fuels for the foreseeable future, which means that carbon dioxide that's coming out the back of the plane is going to have to get dealt with. And right now, the only way of dealing with it sustainably, safely, permanently, is to recapture that carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere and put it back underground. And fortunately, this has been recognized, and people are developing the technology to do it, and it's a real opportunity. And one of the things I think, and it may even feed back, sorry, I'll wrap up, just to sort of throw the ball back to you, it may even feed back to other transport sectors as well, because a little appreciated fact, I feel, in Britain, is the amount we pay in tax on vehicle fuel in the UK, it exceeds the amount it would cost to recapture every single molecule of CO2 that comes out the tailpipes of our cars and trucks and put it back under the North Sea. So that's quite an interesting, and yet, in the name of climate, we are electrifying our transport fleet. Okay? So when we're all driving electric cars, we won't pay any fuel tax. So that tax is going anyway. So there's a certain cognitive dissonance here. And there's also a lot of tension politically about the speed of transition to electrification. And colleagues, particularly here in the Zero Institute in Oxford, who were working hard on electrification, get a little tense when I point this out, because they're shut up, Miles, keep everybody focused on the electrification agenda. In the long term, it's a very good idea to electrify transport. Not just for the climate reason, but for air quality and all sorts of other reasons.
Well, in India, the transition has been quite rapid because most of the electrification has been happening in the two-wheeler and three-wheeler sector. Absolutely. And there's a reason for that, because basically you can retrofit the two-wheelers and three-wheelers, so the upfront cost to buy a new vehicle doesn't exist. In that context, what role do you think that the automotive sector in India have on India's sustainability goals, especially in terms of reduction of greenhouse gas emissions?
So I think, one of the big challenges that we face is infrastructure. You talk about the fact that two-wheelers and three-wheelers will go electric, buses will go electric as well. But I think infrastructure is going to be, a huge challenge, and fueling that infrastructure. Today, we're the third largest in terms of renewable, but we also import a lot of, energy. And I think the goal is to go to 10% of global hydrogen output by, I think it's by 2030 or 2030. So I think there's a lot of investment going in that space. And I think that needs to continue to happen. And again, with the fact that technology is changing so rapidly, there's also, this space is also becoming, people need to be more conscious of the kind of technologies we're building. So, when Miles, when you talk about terrestrial, I'm referring to mobility. So I'm saying we're in mobility, which includes drones, which includes VTOLs, because we're making systems for everything, because the world is moving that direction. And then you've got that whole traffic or, all those systems. So how do we make sure that all that is fueled through green energy? And that's really a key role that, so when people talk to me about the fact that automotive is moving from ICE combustion engine to EV, you're going to lose a lot of opportunity. There's also great, there's a great opportunity to gain in that, because 40% of the vehicle becomes software, right? So there's an opportunity there. Infrastructure, building charging, because the biggest challenge we're facing today with EV is range anxiety. And that's why you're seeing in North America, people go back to hybrid. I mean, I left home with 100%, on my phone, and it's 70 now. And I've charged it once already. I'm already anxious about my phone. So you imagine my car. I need to go back home. I'm like, what happens? So range anxiety is something that is going to have to drive infrastructure development.
So this entire chicken and egg situation in India, people aren't basically transitioning to four-wheelers because there's no charging infrastructure. But the charging infrastructure guys don't want to build the charging infrastructure until there are enough four-wheelers on the road. I think the US has solved that problem quite nicely, because they have this entire vehicle-to-grid system where, because of the dual tariff structure, you can actually charge your car at home at night when electricity tariff rates are low. You go back to the office, you put your car back on the grid, and you can actually make money when tariff rates are high. So you arbitrage the price differential. In India, we don't have any such dual tariff structure. So what do you think is going to drive people to actually start driving four-wheelers? So I understand the two-wheeler and the three-wheeler angle is pretty easy, right? You just retrofit and you drive, and your cost savings per kilometer is 75% vis-a-vis an ICE-powered vehicle. But in the four-wheeler segment, what do you think is going to basically drive that transition?
So Sandeep, I think we're moving in a direction which is, today in our company, we have solar group captive capacity, what we call, where we've, put together a bunch of different units or manufacturing units come together to, put solar projects together to distribute. And I think, again, distribution of power is again a challenge. So I think all these things, will get built out. I think we have bigger challenges when it comes to, fueling electricity, through rural India as opposed to vehicles. But the way that I see the automotive industry, and I get asked this question a lot, the OEMs are investing heavily in electrification. And therefore, we're going to go down that path, and therefore infrastructure will get built out.
Got it.
So I'm not worried about it. I think this is a challenge that we can address easily. How to do it in the correct way. We've got green credit programs in India, again, which is related to the carbon credit program that you have in the US and the EU. So we're moving in that direction, hydrogen storage projects, etc. I think it's all moving in the right direction.
Or you lower the cost of capital, so it becomes cheaper for people to basically spread out the cost over a longer period of time, so that the savings that accrue actually become worth it. From a scientific perspective, what policies do you think governments need to basically introduce to basically drive mobility to address climate change issues? Can you make some suggestions that are generic in nature?
It's back to this sort of challenge of keeping the message positive. I think people don't respond well to being driven, if you see what I mean. I mean, people don't don't react well to sticks. Yeah. So I think one of the challenges we face here, I don't know, I obviously don't know the situation in India, is that the net zero agenda, particularly for transport, is perceived as very prescriptive. You will buy an electric car by this date, you will have to charge it with this system and so on. And that makes it perceived as, and it may not be true, but it's perceived as regressive in the sense that people, in the States, most people have a driveway. It's therefore straightforward to charge your car at home. In the UK, the majority of the population leaves their car in the street because there is no space for driveways. And, we haven't got to this point yet, but, one can imagine in a few years' time a feature of life being people driving around their neighborhood trying to find a free charging point, and all the stress that's going to sort of generate. So particularly when their rich neighbors with the driveway don't have this problem. People can kind of see this social issue coming down the line. So I think we need to be very careful not to take options off the table, which is why I think we should be, not just for aviation, but for the mobility sector in general, we should be accepting the fact that some of our mobility will still be powered by fossil fuels in 2050. And that doesn't mean we have to give up. It just means that that segment of our mobility sector, their climate impact will have to be neutralized by direct air capture and disposal of the CO2 they generate. And it may just be aviation, or it may be in some countries a combination of aviation and heavy goods, or it may be a matter of powering a chunk of our vehicle fleet with hydrogen. By far, at the moment, by far the cheapest way of generating climate neutral hydrogen is starting with natural gas, but capturing the carbon dioxide and putting it back underground. So that's so-called blue hydrogen. So again, I think we need to be very careful about taking options off the table. Getting to net zero is going to be hard. We make it even harder if we tie one hand behind our backs and say we're not going to use this particular option because it's politically unpalatable. And that is happening a lot in Oxford, in Europe. Perhaps even in parts of Oxford, but certainly in Europe, there is a tendency to sort of, make the best the enemy of the good, and I think we need to be much more open-minded about our routes to net zero.
Okay, great. Sanjay, you had mentioned charging infrastructure as a significant challenge that the automotive industry in India is facing as we transition to an electrical sort of platform for adoption of vehicles. Can you talk about some other challenges that the industry faces, and what are some of the innovative ways in which companies in India are addressing those challenges?
So I think, the biggest challenge that we have faced that everyone recognizes is the semiconductor chip issue. And if you looked at what happened in the pandemic, when we went into the pandemic, we were 7% of buying of the semiconductor chips. So we were buying about, I think, $45 billion worth of the 500 billion that was being produced as an automotive industry. When we went into, and the fact is we're at the tail end of the technology when it comes to automotive compared to electronics, and therefore capacity got diverted, and everybody then, if I walked into an OEM in 2020 and I said, where do you buy chips from? They'd ask me, what are you talking about? Today, people will tell me when there'll be a shortage. Every person in that company can tell me, because it's become so valuable, that product, the commodity, whatever you want to call it. And now we're about 15% of semiconductor chips globally is what we as an automotive industry consume. And it's going to go up to 20%. So this is one of the biggest challenges we're facing when it comes to automotive. I know that we have a business based out of Serbia that does millimeter wave radar sensors, and we're looking at designing fabless chips for the automotive industry, again, because that's a challenge. So we talk about infrastructure when it comes to charging. You talk about batteries. Again, cost of batteries, and building that whole sort of, that whole ecosystem out is a huge challenge. Green energy, we've already talked about that. And then the great opportunity that we're seeing is the startup ecosystem. And how do you take that startup ecosystem to convert it into real business? That's really where, because what we're seeing is we're seeing a lot of services businesses in the startup ecosystem, not enough manufacturing. And if I look at the Indian context, we're at about 15 to 17% of GDP manufacturing, and we need to go up to 25% because this great demographic dividend that we have needs jobs. As we go on in the next 5 to 10 years, we need everybody employed, or most of the people employed, and that's really how we can leverage the demographic dividend. So I think, investment in manufacturing, investment in technology, private sector in India is far behind investment in technology than where it should be. If I give you the industry average in the auto component industry, it's 0.5% of revenue. We invest between 3.5% to 6% as a company, but we're not your typical auto component company because they're investing 0.5% of their revenue. So I think investment in technology becomes extremely important. And then, of course, finally, access to talent. Good talent, great talent. We talk about India having, engineers, so many millions of engineers, come out of engineering school. How do we employ those people, and how do we really innovate? And this is what, even the last panel was talking about innovation. How do we build that innovation culture and allow people to fail? So that you can then succeed.
Absolutely. Miles, a question for you. Obviously China controls 70% of lithium refining reserves. And there has been a move globally to kind of de-risk one's economy from the China Association for multiple reasons. How do you really see this transition to electrical mobility possible without the involvement of China? And how easy is it for any country to just turn around and say, I'm going to stop using fossil fuel and move to an electrical economy, to impact climate change positively? Is it that easy to do?
Well, I think as I was saying earlier, we need to recognize that there's many facets to that transition, and it's not being defeatist to say it'll probably take longer than we hope. And therefore, we need to not take anything off the table. Keep it flexible. The more flexible the global economy is, the cheaper the transition will be, and the easier it will be to bring everybody along with it. Whereas if we're sort of overly draconian and saying this is the only solution we're going to accept, then, of course, if there's any pressure on that particular solution pathway, then the entire transition is put at risk. On specifically raw materials and lithium and so on, and dependence on China for rare earths in particular, which obviously play a big role in the electrification challenge. I can't resist. Yes, we absolutely need to de-risk that supply chain and expand the options worldwide. And I can't resist mentioning an initiative at from coming out of Oxford Earth Sciences. The way we mine these days, I don't know if you are aware of this, basically we find an ancient volcano that's long since extinct, and we dig it up, and about probably 0.1% of what we have to dig up is actually what we want. But if you go back to the source and find an active volcano, then these minerals are really concentrated. So our Earth Sciences here in Oxford are working on how we can actually extract the resources we need for the net zero transition from active volcanoes, which I think is so cool.
It is pretty cool.
But they don't actually go right out into the hot red stuff. You can talk to me over lunch if you want to know what they actually do. But it is, it's exploiting our understanding of the planet we live on to use resources in a much more efficient way, because mining is a big energy consumer. The way we do it at the moment is incredibly wasteful. Yeah. We rip off an entire mountaintop to get out 0.1% of the material. The rest of it is just thrown away. I mean, and so if we can identify these places where these crucial minerals are already concentrated by natural processes for us, then that'll definitely help to sort
of
de-risk.
There are alternative chemistries right now that are being
Absolutely,
worked on.
and other ways, and of course, yeah, the work we're doing also in Oxford on perovskite photovoltaics, for example, which is a way of making photovoltaics much less dependent on the raw materials which are very much locked into certain geographies and certain jurisdictions in the world. So yes, de-risking the whole transition is incredibly important. It's something which we have to.
So before we go into just a couple of questions from the audience, it would not be fair for the audience to actually go back home without an opportunity to put some money into their pockets. And for that, I'm going to ask both of you individually, where do you think is the most exciting opportunity in the mobility and sustainability space that you would actually put money behind?
As in a company, or you want
not company, just an area, or a company would be great.
I think,
actually, company would be awesome, but
I think AI. From an automotive mobility perspective, I think AI, with everything that's happening in terms of not just AI for the product, but even for the manufacturing process, it's just transforming. I mean, we've adopted a lot of AI tools within our manufacturing process. It's just completely transformation in terms of what that's doing, to manufacturing and to our industry as a whole.
So AI in automotive and...
So I've got a very different answer. It's seldom that you can see a massive global industry coming down the track several decades ahead, which doesn't exist right now. And that industry is carbon dioxide disposal, permanent carbon dioxide disposal. Right now, we generate 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year. That's faster than ever. We will generate, if we'd started trying to eliminate our production of carbon dioxide 20 years ago, we might have been able to achieve our climate goals by simply stopping using fossil fuels altogether. But we've gone past that point. It's too late. We will generate hundreds of billions of tons, best estimate around 1 trillion tons of carbon dioxide between now and 2100 that will have to be safely captured and disposed of permanently if we're to meet our climate goals. That's a colossal challenge. It'll mean building an industry the size of today's natural gas industry in 20 or 30 years. And right now, it's barely begun. So if I was saying to two things are needed here. Entrepreneurs, of course, to step into that space and come up with clever ideas to particularly reduce the energy cost of capturing carbon dioxide and disposing of it. Right now, this will be the biggest single energy demand industry in the second half of this century. No, hear me out.
Yeah.
Hear me out. And because it's a real opportunity. So we have to cut the energy cost. That's the key, the energy cost of getting rid of carbon dioxide. That's where entrepreneurs should be focused. But we also need governments to put policies in place to make it mandatory that if you're going to use this stuff, you've got to get rid of the CO2. Once we introduce that principle that you've got to dispose of the CO2 generated by the products you sell and the activities you do, then we will move on rapidly through the transition and we will see an explosive growth of this new industry, which is a great opportunity for the future.
Perfect. So you've heard it out here first. AI in automotive and then carbon dioxide disposal companies. So fantastic. We have time for one or two questions. Why don't we go with you?
Yeah, so I heard about what Sanjay talked about hydrogen power generation. What do you think about this as an alternate, and how you say that 10% of production will happen in India? Where do you see the progress that way?
I'm just going by what kind of initiatives the government is putting in place to promote green hydrogen. So I'm just going by, by that kind of data. There's a lot of investment happening with private sector as well to produce that kind of energy. If you look, I won't name companies here, but if you look at the companies, the larger companies, they're investing heavily in terms of building out green hydrogen. That's really the aim, and therefore all that investment is going into green hydrogen, and that's why.
Do you hear the adoption?
Sorry?
Do you hear an adoption or a test or a pilot? We don't hear such things.
Let me add to that. Basically, green hydrogen right now is $5 a kg. And for it to basically become really attractive, it has to drop down to $1 a kg. And the R&D that's actually happening will probably take 7 to 8 years before we actually see that $1 kg. So right now, all of the stuff that's happening is actually happening at a lab level. There is no adoption because it's not commercially viable at this price.
There's a $45 to $50 billion.
But it's huge. This is where the government of India is actually spending its time as an alternative. Yep. Last question.
I'm an automotive engineer, so really interesting things. My question to you is actually short. What do you think about battery recycling in India? Because I'm long on that.
Yeah, so it's a big industry. You've got Loha, you've got other companies like that. And I was going to say the other big bet is recycling. Not just in the battery space, and in rubber recycling, tires, removing.
Your time was worth it just to come and hear this. You got 3 ideas to make money.
Yeah, so recycling is big.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Sandeep, I just want to thank Sid for putting this together. I don't know where he is. There he is. Just for bringing us all together. Thanks so much, Sid.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. We request everybody to please be seated for the next session. Up next, we are honored to welcome 2 distinguished guests today, Mr. Rohan Murthy and Professor Chas Bontra, who will be engaging in a fireside chat on the topic Harnessing AI for Sustainable Development in India. Mr. Rohan Murthy is the founder and CTO of Sirocco, a company specializing in process discovery and automation. Mr. Murthy holds a PhD from Harvard, a BS from Cornell, and was a fellow at MIT. Remarkably, during his time at Harvard, he was selected as a junior fellow, becoming only the 2nd computer scientist in the program's 80-year history, following the legendary Marvin Minsky, the father of artificial intelligence. Moderating this session is Professor Chas Bontra, the Pro Vice Chancellor for Innovation at Oxford. Professor Chas is a leading figure in drug discovery and innovation, recognized as one of the top innovators in industry and honored with the Order of the British Empire. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Mr. Rohan Murthy and Professor Chas Bontra to the stage.
Where do you want me to sit?
Are you kicking off? Are you going to kick off?
I have no idea what happens now.
I thought Rohan was going to lead this. Or Rohan, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself? We heard a little bit about your background, but tell us a bit about yourself.
That almost feels like an interview question. Okay, I'm an academic turned entrepreneur. I come from a family where we are teachers for 7 generations. And in my generation, I was the last hope, the last Jedi. And everyone thought I'd be a professor. I gave up academia to start a tech company. We are based primarily out of Boston, but also between India and Singapore and now London. And so I was in the UK, and Siddharth invited me saying, come to Oxford to the business school and speak, and so here I am.
So tell me, what do you worry about in terms of AI, sustainability, India? What keeps you awake at night?
Actually, before that, maybe, if it's okay, let me take a slight detour in answering that, right? Why is there so much excitement around AI this time around? Because if you sort of see trends in technology, it's sort of always in waves, and the first wave may fail, the second wave may fail, finally the third wave really lands. In the 80s, there was the great hope of AI, and everybody thought that was the time when AI was really going to deliver on all the promises that Alan Turing and many others had dreamt of for computing, and it did not. And so when I was an undergraduate student, which was early 2000s, it was not very fashionable to be working on AI those days. And the difference this time around, perhaps, is that 10 years ago, AI was very much used, but it was used in ways that maybe perhaps many of us were unaware of. So if you were transacting with your bank, it was being used in the back end to find anomalies, to detect malicious, seemingly malicious transactions and so on. So it didn't really directly affect you on a regular basis, but it was there, and somewhere lurking in the background. But this time around, in this current wave, I think it fundamentally changes the interface between humans and machines. And that's why everybody's grandmother here will know about what, or would have heard of GPT. May not know what it is, it doesn't matter, but would have heard of it. Because for the first time, it's doing something that fundamentally alters how humans and machines have a relationship. And I think that's very important to understand why it's much more real this time around than in any of its previous avatars. And so having said that, that's sort of the first thing. And the second thing is, how does it change this relationship between people and machines? Fundamentally, it changes this. It's some of these advances that have happened in the recent past have, made it. I'll use some words fairly loosely, but I don't mean to be precise. We now have these algorithms that can understand relationships between large pieces of text, can read Faisal Devji's book and pretend to summarize it as if an intelligent person has read the book, but it's not really the case. There are some very complex relationships between words that have been deciphered and so on. But to cut a much longer story short, I think what the current avatar of what AI does is it redefines humanity's relationship with words. And that is actually an extremely fundamental point. We have not had an invention or an innovation in computing that has been this transformative in terms of changing how we think of words or our connection to words. Now, why is that important? Because most of recorded history, not all, is in words, right? Our histories are written in words, our literature is in words, our communication is, big part of it is in words, and so on and so forth. And so if that is the case, then I think the future that the current wave portends is one where you start to ask things like, what is real, what is fake? Turns out you can extend this argument to not just words, but to audio, to video. And so then the questions become even more urgent and pressing. What is real? What is not real? What is synthetic? What does it mean to be synthetic? I don't know. How do you take exams? What is original piece of work? I don't know. I feel like, at least in my own case, I don't have a very good answer for these kinds of questions, seeing all of the recent advances. I thought I knew, but I don't anymore.
In the earlier conversation, Miles was saying, in talking about carbon dioxide capture and I agree with him. I mean, I think when we have an emergency like the climate emergency, we need to throw everything at it. The kitchen sink, we need to try everything. Green energy, biodiversity, carbon capture, everything. We should be doing it. Just like in the pandemic, nobody knew which vaccine was going to work. Many of my colleagues said we won't get a vaccine for COVID-19. Now, fortunately, we tried lots of things and we had a number of successes, but we were lucky. So I think we need to do exactly the same. I think we're not good at predicting the future. I mentioned earlier these trillion-dollar companies. I don't think there's anybody in this room who could have predicted NVIDIA would today be worth more than 3 trillion, or Apple would be, or a company that started off delivering books through letterboxes, Amazon, would be worth nearly 2 trillion. We're not good at it. So the tough question for you, Rohan, is what's this world going to look like even in 10 years, 20 years? Because we all talk about AI, it's going to impact everything, and we can talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, etc. We can talk about the impact of AI in each of those, etc. But where do you think we're going to be in 10, 20 years' time?
I have no idea. In fact, I'll tell you, in the confines of our own company, okay, forget the world. I mean, this is a company that I started. I continue to be shocked by what I see that our teams are doing, because we've built a foundation model of a certain kind. Our model basically today behaves like it's a McKinsey consultant. If any of you are going to be an analyst or associate McKinsey, our model will do whatever you're doing. I didn't think that would happen 3 years ago. So I mean, if I can't foresee what we're doing within the confines of a young organization, I don't know where we'll be 10 or 20 years from now. It's exactly because of what you said. In fact, I'm sure we have lots of theories and hypotheses, but the pace of development, as an example, 2 years ago, I think the world had at least publicly released open source models, something like about 6,000 or 7,000. Today, there are over 50,000. And some of these models can do really, really dramatic things. I listened to so my uncle is a professor of astrophysics at Caltech. I listened to his talk recently, and he was talking about how his group are using AI models to completely automate discovery of the night sky without a human in the loop. And this AI model is doing the discovery and then writing these papers. And if you really think about it, one of the oldest activities of humankind is to look up at the stars and wonder about our place in the universe. And we now say that we have models that can pretty much do most of these activities. So it's, I think the pace of change, particularly in this area, is so high. At least I may not have the intelligence to say what will it be 5 years or 10 years from now.
Rohan, I don't want to embarrass you. You're one of the smartest people in this room and on the planet. But sort of, if you can't give us advice on this, because the purpose of this discussion today is, I could make a case for the importance of AI in healthcare, energy, climate, food production, water, reducing pollution in air, land, sea, everything. The things I worry about with respect to AI is the energy consumption of these data centers and where that energy is going to come from. And I also worry about increased inequality. At the moment, we've got massive educational inequality, income inequality, gender inequality. But there's a third of people on the planet who do not know how to use the internet, etc. So potentially the inequalities. So what do you worry about? I mean, I'm afraid my brain works. I always think about problems and then I think about solutions. So give me some problems to think about.
So a couple of things. See, for all the things that you just mentioned, right? Energy is a very legitimate one, legitimate concern, because so far the large successes we have seen have been models that require tremendous amounts of compute power to train in particular, and inference is also expensive. But there's still hope, because you're seeing, for example, a very young company with only 40 people, I think as of a few days ago valued at 6 billion, sitting in Paris, who have developed Mistral, for those of you who don't know, developed models that are quite competitive with these large models, and yet their energy footprint is much smaller. even in their training. In fact, that has been the entire value proposition, to say, look, you don't need to be energy, quote unquote, inefficient. You can actually do it with far less resources. You can be far better. So there may be some hope. When it comes to inequality of people not having asymmetric access to the internet and so on, well, if on-device AI models do succeed, which I think they will, so you're not only going to have these large models in the cloud consuming tremendous amounts of power, you'll have models on phones and so on, which don't require internet connectivity and which can be multilingual. I actually think perhaps our best chance of leveling the inequality will be these very helpful agents on these devices, these AI agents. So I tend to look at all of these and think, I don't see the future as being full of problems. I see it as being full of possibilities for each one of these things. And that doesn't mean that the concerns today are not legitimate. But I also see green shoots that suggest that maybe the future will be different. So I don't worry about it in that sense, about some of these, because to me, these are a matter of time before they get resolved.
I mean, I do agree with that. I mean, I think where I get my optimism from is sort of, you know, I'm fortunate in this great university. I'm surrounded by many geniuses. Many of them are very young, and some of them are sitting in this room, and some of them are even younger than yourself, Rohan. And they are so smart and passionate and creative and entrepreneurial, et cetera, et cetera. And that's where I get my hope. I completely buy that. So let me try and prod this another way. So one of the other reasons for this meeting is sort of, you know, I always think working in Oxford is an absolute privilege. We've got brilliant people, we've got great brand name, we've got alumni all over the world, we've got wonderful networks, we've got geniuses like Miles working on all sorts of problems, et cetera, et cetera. We've got a brilliant business school. There's nothing we cannot do. All the problems I talked about at the start, we've got colleagues in this university working in all those areas, et cetera. Now, the purpose of this meeting is to think about sort of how can we in Oxford work with our friends in India to do something that's going to be step-changing, transformative, et cetera. You know, I would like out of this meeting, I don't just want us to go home and, you know, say, oh, we had a great time chatting with Rohan, et cetera. I want us to go home and think about, there's one or two things we're going to follow up on. So what are those one or two things we could do?
So let me first say something about India and then maybe tie it back to Oxford. In my limited estimation, I don't yet know if we have the talent in India, but we don't have the training in India to be able to innovate on models. At least this is what I find when I recruit people in India. America has the largest talent pool. I mean, this is nascent talent, but it's exceedingly complex, this work. It's not easy. It's not for the faint-hearted. I suspect the UK, I know for a fact the UK does, some parts of Europe too, but I don't think we have the requisite training to be able to, you know, say, okay, we'll iterate and build the next version of the model, the next more energy-efficient model, as an example, in India. Now, of course, there's a separate debate. Do you need to do this or not? I mean, we'll put that aside just for a moment. Okay, so if you can't do that, then what can you do? What you can do is you can take any of these open source models and you can train it on a whole bunch of data. And that's how maybe you can build some use cases, you can build some competitive advantage, et cetera, and so on. And so you either need trained talent as your secret sauce, and or certainly you need data. Now, data we have plenty of in India, and I know that India also has data protection laws and so on, which in this case work to its favor. We have data from landed records to health records, of which we don't have a standardization, but nonetheless, it's a great opportunity to standardize, to financial data, to pretty much everything else. And we have data at large scale and large volumes. And it turns out that is exactly of the kind or nature of what you need for these models to do quite well. They need a lot of data and so on. And so sort of my perspective on this has been to build any kind of a play or advantage or of any kind in India with respect to AI, it has to revolve around data. It's not yet a talent play. Not in India, not yet. Again, it doesn't mean, I'm not saying, I don't want someone to think, hey, Indians can't do AI. Obviously, that's not what I'm saying. It's quite to the contrary. If you actually see the revolutionary paper in 2017 published from Google Brain, I think the two lead authors were from India, but sitting in London. I think what India can do, at least in the meantime, is to invest very heavily in curating these data sets, cleaning these data sets, training models on these data sets, and then discovering use cases of what does a trained model on these data sets, what can it do?
Let me try and have another go at this. I mean, I
feel like I'm resisting something that you wish to get to.
Sort of, this is good. And then I want to open it up to questions, etc. So our Vice Chancellor is a lady named Irene Tracy. Praveen knows him well. And Miles, you know her a little bit well, I think. Sort of. Absolutely brilliant lady. She did this review for our Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, which published at the end of December. It was on sort of innovation, entrepreneurship in universities and spin-outs, et cetera, et cetera. And then a couple of months ago, there was a House of Lords Select Committee, and unfortunately Irene couldn't go, so Muggins had to go. But sort of, I was asked the following question: what is the difference between the US and the UK? And I said the difference is money and culture, you know. And let me just explore that culture bit. So my sense in the US, they have more of a moonshot culture. We're going to land somebody on the moon, we're going to cure cancer, et cetera, et cetera. We don't have that in UK, Europe, you know. If somebody comes up with a big problem here, immediately 10 people jump on that individual and say, oh, no, you won't do that. It's too risky. You won't get the funding for it, etc. But I think the other thing I like about the US is they're risk-taking, they're confident, they're ambitious. And I said earlier that the reason I'm optimistic about these problems I worry about is young entrepreneurs like the people sitting in this room. They're going to solve them. People like Rishi over there, he's going to solve them, etc. People like you. That's why I'm optimistic. But sort of, so if there was one ambitious goal that we could do together, what would it be, Rohan?
When you say we could do together, you mean Oxford in India or the UK?
Well, UK and India, I don't mind. I don't care. I mean, I just care about bringing scale and urgency to some of these problems and bringing the right people to those problems.
So I actually think the UK has lots of right people, trained talent in AI, and India has all the data. And I think the mix of the two is where the intersection really lies. We have to find use cases now. Okay, so you have talent, you have data, okay, what can you do with the two? And we have to find use cases for these. And it can be across the board. It can be in, I mean, pretty much. For example, I know there are lots of folks in the Valley who work on health, training models on health data. But we have far more health data in India, except, you know, it's not yet aggregated, not yet cleaned, et cetera, and so on. But with the right kind of talent, partnering with the right kind of data curation in India, I think something meaningful can be done when it comes to health, when it comes to detection of various problems. I mean, that's just one of far too many examples like this. Whenever you go to register a house in India, it's not a straightforward process in terms of it's not digitized and so on. And so we have lots of land records, historical archives and land records, none of which, or rather, all of which are prime fodder for AI models. Because you often have to find the lineage for, is this property really owned by the person selling it? And you often don't know. And it turns out after you buy, years later, you're stuck in lawsuits and so on and so forth. All of which can actually be really dealt with the appropriate data being trained on the right kinds of models or the right kinds of iterations of models. So I always think of India as large data source, and you bring the right set of people in, and you can solve some problems.
So Praveen, AI, healthcare, data, India. That's your next job. Okay, so let's open it up to questions. Please, oh my goodness. Over there, that young lady there. Could we get a microphone, please? And can we make the questions brief?
Rohan, this is what you said about talent and training. And my question is how easy it is to commoditize anything in India, especially with regards to templatization, education, everything else. And that makes it very, very easy for AI. But you come to leadership and management, what we study here, and which is more about EI, right? The emotional quotient and emotional intelligence. Could you tell us a little more about your journey from AI to EI?
Well, according to my wife, I have not achieved that journey.
I've been married a lot longer, and I can tell you, you never achieve that journey.
So I'm not sure I have a very intelligent response to your rather thoughtful question. So yeah, I don't really know what to say.
I think that's a conversation over lunch. So can we have a microphone here, please? Second row behind Sumitra. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Hi, Rohan. I'm Jago Shetty. I'm a DPhil in medical history, and I know about the translation work that is done in the Murthy Classical Library. I liked what you said about AI redefining the relationship of human beings and language. What I want to know is how can AI redefine and perhaps improve the understanding of the history of language, literature, and perhaps what is lost in translation?
That's a fantastic question. So I'll just add a little bit of context to the question that's asked. So many years ago, I started a nonprofit, which is perhaps amongst the largest translation projects in the world. It's called the Murthy Classical Library of India. It's based at Harvard. What we do is we attempt to broaden the definition of classics. So now as a grad student, I happened to be sitting next to a classics professor at dinner somewhere, and then he said, classics is, he was talking about Greek and Latin, and my mother tongue is about roughly 2,000 years old. It's a language called Kannada, spoken by 60 million people in India. So I asked him, why is my mother tongue not a classic? He said, no, it actually is. It's possibly, it is. We just don't have access to the text. So one thing led to another, and ended up starting this project. We have, what we do is we take texts from about 14 different classical Indian languages: Sanskrit, Old Tamil, Old Kannada, medieval Marathi, medieval Bangla, etc., and so on, and we translate them to English. So if you open our books, on the left-hand side is the original script, the right-hand side you have the translation, and we do this for literature in these languages, in the classical forms of these languages. And the project is now roughly, actually it's about 10 years, it's 10th year of its iteration, and we want to do this for the next 90 years or so about a 100-year project. The reason your question is so interesting is that, at its launch, we had launches around the world, and we had one launch here in London at the Indian High Commission in 2014, and we had this fantastic Punjabi text translated by a professor, I think at UCL, one of the schools in London, and his name is Christopher Shackle. And so Chris Shackle spent 50-odd years of his life being an expert on Punjabi literature, which was fascinating for me. I'd never met somebody like him. And so somebody at the time said, hey, you're a computer scientist. Why do you need scholars in 40 different countries doing these translations? And I remember saying, there's no technology I can think of that would be as good as Chris Shackle. Because, I mean, he's a remarkable scholar, 52 years of his life just studying Punjabi and doing these translations. Now, having said that, today, if the same question were asked, I'd probably think of it a little differently. Because I don't know if these models are at the maturity of a Chris Shackle, but they can begin to emulate a Chris Shackle in limited ways. And that's far more than what we could ever do earlier on. And so there are debates that we're having, for example, at the Classical Library Project, where we're wondering, saying, because we're doing these translations and we have these expert translators doing these things across the globe, and the left-hand side is the original script, the right-hand side is English, what happens if we feed all of this into a model do we in some sense preserve some kind of essence of these languages in these models? Because there are languages, by the way, where we are not able to find translators. Because the next generation are all people like most people in this room and myself, you know, glasses, engineering, computer science, don't really study the classics, right? So may not know the classical forms. And so if we want to do this for the next 90 or 100 years, on some languages should we quote unquote give up and just train models? And yes, our translations will not be as good, but maybe that's the best we can do. And so there is this active debate going on at the Board of Trustees right now. In fact, they've brought in computer scientists and classicists, and they're all debating. I happen to be sitting in through one of these meetings listening in, and the classicists were, of course, saying to the computer scientists, saying, oh, but this translation is nothing like the scholarly translations we do. And they're right, but we may have no choice. And that is, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that was not even a considered option, which it is now. Right? And so we'll have to see.
Dhananjay Thackeray from India. So when we talk about sustainable development in India, and especially about the grassroots development, so it depends on the critical demographics, geography of India, which you know. So how the AI can help in this, because it depends on the sampling, surveys. Even if we do it manually, we find errors. How AI can help in it, and what are the gaps, challenges, and solutions in this?
For me, the most important thing it can do at any grassroots anywhere is level education, more than anything else. Perhaps health too, but I've not thought about health enough, but certainly on education. You can bring uniformity to understanding or to explanation of information in a way that we previously just could not. See, today you have Wikipedia, right? And so if you have, it really depends on the reader and the context of the reader to be able to understand it well enough. And so information is useful, but not enough. Whereas if you want to make any change at grassroots, my first bet would be on education.
Last question.
Last question. Rohan,
I know, Wasim. You can ask your question offline, Wasim. You don't even need to ask the question here.
No, but there is something which you don't answer sometimes. This is public, you're supposed to answer.
Keep it brief, please.
Simple question. Why did you choose what you chose to do? You could choose anything in the world when you passed out of college. So why did you choose to be doing what exactly you're doing in Soroko? Secondly, how you're applying or harnessing AI? Because you are supposed to be a very big advocate of AI. So how these two things you thought about and you're actually doing it?
Great question. So very specifically, just to give some context, what I found, I'm very inspired by manufacturing. I think all those folks who do anything in computing should look towards manufacturing for more lessons. We tend to have this artificial distinction that somehow computing is the future and a lot of these industries with their hands are the past. I don't quite buy that. What I find fascinating about manufacturing is it's taken us 100 years to develop a disciplined way of building things, right? You can take any large complex object, whether you're sending it into space or a car, break it down to a million little parts, assembly line, etc., and you have a detailed discipline for doing this. In fact, there are departments in universities, operations research, industrial engineering, that study all of these things. But when it comes to office work, which is what a majority of people here in this room do, where we use some computing device for doing our work, whether you're in a bank or a retail company, whatever it is, we tend to think that's very different. And there's no rigor or scientific way for understanding office work, for understanding what's wrong with it. And that always struck me as rather remarkable. The best guess that we have had for 40 years is to hire consultants. They'll come, you have an instinct, they'll ask a few people a few questions, and then they'll tell you what's wrong and what to fix. And so what I found very interesting was, how do I create a science of work, how we work? I felt there's, not that I felt, I know for a fact, there is no science for office work. And so I saw an opportunity to take some of the work that I had done in academia with a little bit more effort to be able to create a fundamental scientific basis for understanding and improving office work. And I thought, hey, this is great. I get to do some academic work and build a product out of it and maybe have some impact in the world with it. And so that's why I decided to leave academia to start a company.
So I think we need to finish there. The time is up. I'll just make a couple of comments. Firstly, I mentioned earlier, some of you may have heard me, that sort of my mother had a stroke 3 weeks ago. And so she's now stopped talking, and she's hopefully starting to talk. And, you know, for somebody who's had a mother for 63 years and she's nagged me every day for 63 years and then she stops talking, it's quite hard. So when I go and see her in the evening, you know, I often think sort of, what could I do? Because she is trying to talk. And what could I do to sort of help facilitate, et cetera, et cetera. So it's just another example of how this sort of technology skill set, I think, is going to completely change all walks of our life. The final comment is, look, you know, I absolutely love my job, and I love my job because I meet so many truly brilliant people. And increasingly, these truly brilliant people are very, very young. And Rohan, you're another one on the list. So thank you. Please, can I ask you all to applaud them?
What an insightful session that was. I would now like to call on stage Mr. Dakshesh Mavani, the newly elected mayor of Surat, for a short speech. Mr. Mavani has dedicated over 2 decades to public service in various capacities within the Surat Municipal Corporation. Under his visionary leadership, Surat has not only initiated transformative urban projects, but has also achieved the top rank in India's cleanliness survey. His passion extends beyond administration, focusing on the welfare of vulnerable communities and cultural enrichment. Please join me in welcoming Mayor Dakshesh Mavani.
Sister and brothers, distinguished guests, and esteemed member of the Oxford India Forum. It is both an honor and privilege to stand here before you today representing the vibrant and dynamic city of Surat, a city that embodies the spirit of religious and innovation. I would like to share with you how Surat is role model as a city to sustainable futures. Surat has experienced unprecedented growth from being a most modest port cities and transport into one of the fastest growing cities, not just in India, but across the world. As per the Global Cities 2030 report, Oxford Economics, Surat is at the forefront of renewable energy generation in India, producing over 50 megawatt of electricity from renewable sources, solar, wind, and biogas. We are also proud to be the first city in Gujarat to implement dedicated electric vehicle policy, underscoring our commitment to reducing carbon emission and promoting sustainable transport solution. Our water waste management to equally impressive, support by extensive infrastructure. It not only keeps our water bodies clean, but also serves as a model for the circular economy. We are proud to be recognized as the cleanest city in India. Our solid waste management practice include a comprehensive garbage-free city initiative, a textile waste management plant, and construction and demolition waste management plant. Our 3 rapid public transport system, including the bus rapid transport system, city buses, and upcoming metro system. We ensure connectively, sustainably at the same time. There is a lot more in, but for now, thank you for opportunity. Say Surat's story together. Let's forge path sustainable future. Thanks to Chairman Siddharth Sethi and President Priyansh Gujati, Oxford invite from that team for invite for me. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Mavani. Now, it is my honor to introduce Mr. Jayant Sinha, a distinguished member of Parliament and former Minister of State for Finance and Civil Aviation. Currently, he chairs the Standing Committee on Finance and serves on the Public Accounts Committee. Mr. Sinha has been elected twice to the Lok Sabha with significant majorities. His prior experience includes leadership roles at McKinsey, Umidyar Network, and Courage Capital, showcasing his expertise in business and investment management. Beyond politics and business, Mr. Sinha is an advisor to India's international movement to unite nations, reflecting his commitment to global unity. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Jayant Sinha.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and let me first thank Siddharth and the entire team that's been organizing the Oxford India Forum. I'm told that this is the first time this forum has been organized, but I think it's doing splendidly. We've had wonderful guests and a very large turnout, so I'm very excited to be here to talk to you a little bit about climate change. But first, a pitch for Oxford. Now, of course, we've had great alumni here, great scientists, fantastic physicians, fantastic medical doctors, but I must tell you that from childhood, I have been an incredible fan of J.R.R. Tolkien. So for me to come to Oxford and to come to Tolkien's home is the best gift that you could bestow on me. So thank you very much for inviting me here. Now, as I was just telling Professor Allen, I flew in this morning from Delhi. And of course, as you know, I'm going to talk about climate change and net zero. And I must tell you that when I came from Delhi, it was 45 degrees, and I could feel like I could really talk about global warming. But when I got here and I got off the plane, I found it was 14 degrees centigrade. And I know all of you, when I start talking about global warming, you're going to say, what global warming? It's so chilly here today. And friends, that's what makes this discussion on climate change and global warming so difficult. I will get into it in some detail, but you must understand that among the problems that humanity confronts, this is one of the most difficult ones. And the difference between Delhi at 45 degrees and Oxford at 14 degrees is part of it. There are really three reasons why this is such a wicked problem. Number one, there's enormous variability. So Delhi is at 45, Oxford is at 14. And so it's very difficult to separate out what is natural variability from what the trends are. Number two, it's a long-term problem. So anybody who's freezing in the winter is going to say, well, what do I care about global warming? What's going to happen 50 years from now, 30 years from now? How does that matter? But it does matter, and it is affecting us today. So it's a long-term trend, so we tend to ignore it because we're only worried about who's going to win the IPL match today or who's going to win in the T20 World Cup. So we tend to ignore these longer-term problems. And number three, and which is what makes it so fiendishly complicated, is that it is a global problem. And we're not used to politically, and I know a little bit about this, we're not used to politically thinking about poor people in Bangladesh or poor people in sub-Saharan Africa or poor people in India, because everybody's worried about what's going to happen to my taxes here in the city of Oxford. So politics is local, politics is personal, politics is not global. And when you're confronted with a global problem, our political systems, the way in which we work together, the policy responses become very difficult to happen. That's why climate change is such a difficult problem. But if we can have the presentation, is that going to come up now? Sorry. There you go. The good news, and I want to thank Professor Allen for highlighting this earlier, is that there is a path forward. Even as this is such a difficult problem, net zero actually for humanity is net positive. It is net positive. It is in fact the development path we must follow. And so rather than thinking about net zero as something that's negative for us, we need to understand it's actually very, very positive for us. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Now, let's understand that because of net zero, and I say this as an engineer, we have an opportunity to invest trillions of dollars. Professor Allen spoke about carbon capture. Sanjay talked about electric mobility. We have incredible investment opportunities. Trillions of dollars are going to flow in this. All of you who are here from the business school or engineers, scientists, entrepreneurs, this is the story of your life. Trillions of dollars are going to flow into it. And they're required. We need it because of climate change. And for India as well, this is the path forward. Net zero development should be the path forward for India. And if we all get together and understand why this is so positive for us, why this is so important for us, you will immediately begin to understand that net zero development is the path forward for the planet. Now, I know right after this is lunch. I'm sure many of you are already thinking, am I going to eat this sandwich or that sandwich? So I'm a former McKinsey consultant, so please excuse the charts. So I'll try and get through the charts quickly, and I want to leave a little bit of time for questions and whatever might be on your mind. So let me go through the charts quickly, if you don't mind. But let's recognize that global warming is accelerating. Global warming is accelerating. What was happening relatively slowly in the past is now speeding up. And that's why we have all these extreme weather events, all this heat wave, all of the stuff that's happening. India is badly, badly hit by all of this. It's happening now. We are seeing cyclones that we never saw before in Mumbai. We are already sustaining massive damage as a result of all of this. And the heat waves. I'm just coming from Delhi, it's 45 degrees, it's like a furnace out. And these heat waves have been going on and on and on in South Asia. And the prediction of climate scientists like Professor Allen and others is that northern India will have maximum temperatures of mid-50s. Now, I know at 14 or 15 degrees centigrade, you can't even conceive of mid-50s. But trust me, it's very unpleasant. Everybody needs air conditioning, otherwise you cannot survive. How many of you read Ministry for the Future? Anyone? Ministry for the Future? You must read it. It's a wonderful book. It's about what climate change will do to us by the 2030s. Fantastic book, authors Kim Stanley Robinson. But let me tell you, it starts with the heat wave in North India that kills millions of people. It's worse than COVID and the pandemic. So these are very real, lethal dangers that we are confronting right now. There are other things that are happening where we are not paying attention. How many of you spend too much time worrying about what's happening in the Antarctica? What's the rise of, seawater there, temperatures there, and what is that doing to the various glaciers of the Antarctica? Does anyone worry about this? But we should. Because the Antarctica is the refrigerator for the planet. And when that refrigerator starts to warm up, we need to get really worried about what's going on. And the warming in Antarctica is happening much faster than anyone anticipated. The Thwaites Glacier famously is collapsing much faster. Professor Allen, of course, can speak much more at length about this. But this is important to understand. Because as all of this begins to collapse, it just gets warmer and warmer and warmer. And of course, as you all know, we've got to move much, much faster than we are moving right now. As of now, we are on track to hit 2.9 degrees centigrade global average mean temperature increase by 2100. I'm going to stop here for a second. Because this number 2.9 has to be understood properly. 2.9 degrees centigrade. This is global average mean temperature. This includes the oceans and it includes land. 2/3 of the planet is ocean. That means if global average mean temperature goes to 2.9 degrees centigrade for the globe, land temperatures could well increase by 4 degrees centigrade. And 4 degrees centigrade across the board, I've already said that we're going to have mid-50s temperatures in northern India in 20 or 30 years. How is the world going to cope with this kind of climate change? It's a very serious issue. And therefore, we have no choice but to follow a net zero development model. The good news is, and this is the opportunity, I want to get away from the doom and gloom and talk about the trillions of dollars, Ranu, that is going to be invested here. The net zero development model that India must follow, which we are already embarked on, is renewable energy, for our power systems, electric vehicles across the board, which is what Professor Allen and Sanjay were talking about, various biofuels, green hydrogen, and we've got to integrate with the global carbon market and have carbon emissions trading. These are the 4 fundamental pillars of what a net zero development model has to be for India's development. And this is not theory, folks. If you look at what China is doing today, China is already the world leader when it comes to green development. They have the most renewables, they have the most solar panels, they have the most electric vehicles, they're racing ahead of everyone literally. Even in robo-taxis, they are ahead of everyone. They're doing all kinds of interesting experiments with hydrogen, hydrolyzers, and they've already rolled out a carbon emissions trading scheme. So China is already there, and the money and the effort and the policies that China has makes them a world leader when it comes to net zero development, green technologies. China has committed to net zero by 2060. Some people believe that their emissions have already peaked and that from now on they're going to be decreasing their emissions. And they are by far the biggest emitter in the world now. Currently, just so you understand, the emissions trajectory for India is that we're going to go from 3.5 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions to 14 billion tons by 2050. India's emissions are nowhere near peaking. In fact, they're increasing. So we've got to change that trajectory, folks. And net zero is net positive for India. Over the last 5 or 6 years, I have done extensive economic and climate modeling with some of the world's greatest modelers and experts and scientists on this. And what we found, and multiple people have run multiple models, what we found running all these models is net zero is massively net positive for India. When we look at it in terms of air pollution, Lancet and others have told us we're killing millions of people every year because of air pollution. We're going to bring down air pollution because we're going to have much cleaner air. GDP and jobs growth is going to be faster than any baseline projection. And of course, as far as energy security is concerned, we will not have to import this much in terms of fossil fuels. And remember, whom are we competing against? We're competing against China, we're competing against Japan, we're competing against Germany. So a green economy, friends, any one of you who's interested in business, a green economy is a competitive necessity for India and for the global south. We have to do this. Now, what's the catch? So net zero is net positive. Let's all go do it. Let's let it all happen tomorrow. But there is a catch. And this is where Ranu and his folks come in, which is it's going to cost a lot of money. We need a lot of financing. We need a lot of investment. And the models are telling us it's going to cost us trillions of dollars of incremental investment. That's good news because investments mean faster growth, more jobs. But it also means we need the money. And frankly, whether it's India or other countries in the global south, we don't have the capital. As it is, most of India's development on the margin is driven by foreign capital. So if we need more, trillions of dollars more, $50 to $100 billion a year more now, it's got to have to come from right here, from the city of London, from Oxford, from the global north, friends. And it has to go across the economy. This is, trust me, this is the only McKinsey chart in the deck. That's why you can't read it. Don't even bother. So it's going to have to transform the economy, but it's happening now. How many of you have flown into Bangalore Terminal 2? Do you love it? Don't you love it? This is the future. These are the kinds of facilities we will build if we think net zero. This is a net zero terminal. It's beautiful, it's gorgeous, and it's green. We can do it, folks. We can do it. And when we do it working together, it's going to be a triple win. It's going to be a win for the planet, it's going to be a win for the global north, and it's going to be a win for the global south. We all have to work together to achieve this net zero development. And it's a win for the global north. Net zero is net positive for the global north because your investors are going to make money. Your companies are going to prosper. And we had, the Vice Chancellor of Innovation saying he wants $1 trillion company right here in Oxford. Maybe it's going to be a carbon capture company, Professor Allen. Right? So we can create these incredible companies. We can give better returns to the pensioners, to the investors of the global north, if we can funnel this capital to the global south and enable them to invest and earn returns. But we need to facilitate, and that's why I said that the global problems are so difficult. We need to facilitate the policy mechanisms, the blended finance instruments that will make these capital flows possible. And they need to happen. If you look at what is happening with migration around the world, which is huge political pressure, here in the UK and around Europe and in the US, immigration is such an important issue. A lot of what is happening is actually triggered by climate change. So it's in the interests of the global north to be able to make the global south prosperous so that we can deal with these kinds of humanitarian issues. Climate refugees are already making life very difficult in the global north. And so the global north must provide financial support. And this will have to come through the multilateral development banks, from the World Bank, the IFC, from the European Investment Bank, from the Asian Development Bank. We need these MDBs to be able to take capital which exists in abundance in the global north. And through these blended finance instruments, whether it's currency swaps, climate insurance, happy to go offline and discuss this in detail with you, because this is what I've been doing for the last 5 years, is to come up with these mechanisms by which we can get these blended finance instruments to work on behalf of global north investors. Their investments are protected and the cost of capital in the global south goes down, so the hurdle rates go down and we get more investments. That's what we need to do. And if we do that, for those of you who are investors, those of you who think about wealth creation, in the last 20 years in India, we've created about $3 trillion of wealth because GDP to market cap has been roughly 1:1. Ranu, the best is yet to come. If we can sustain green growth and grow 6 to 7% a year, if we added $3 trillion of wealth, Ranu, is going to get very rich, folks. So I hope, Shumitru, you're going to hit on Ranu for some big donations here. So whatever you have right now, the next 20 years is going to be 4 times that. 4 times that. Because if you can sustain green growth, create inclusive and green growth for India, continue to grow at 6% a year, we're growing off a much larger base. $4 trillion is going to go to $16 trillion. That means $12 trillion of wealth creation. $12 trillion of wealth creation. Folks, Sandeep asked about where the opportunities are. Green is where the opportunities are. Green is going to be where you as entrepreneurs, business people, scientists, inventors are going to do really, really well. Net zero is net positive. Okay? So that's what we have for the economy. But this is for you as individuals as well. Too often when I talk about net zero, I hear people saying, why should I care? What can I do? Folks, this is affecting us every single day. And there's a lots that you can do. Everybody taking one step means a billion steps in India. So you can lead a much more frugal lifestyle. You can be much more vegan. You can use an electric vehicle. All of us can make a huge difference. We must make a huge difference. And particularly for young people, please, I beg you, for your future, don't check out. Pay attention. This is really, really serious, really, really important. You have to be the change. You have to be the change that you want to see in the world. You have to model this. You are the vanguard. You are the pioneers. You are the inventors. You are the entrepreneurs. You are going to have to make a difference. We've wrecked the economy. We've wrecked the world. I'm happy to be handing it over all to you so that you can fix all of this. Thank you very much. Yes, please. Yes, sure.
Thank you, sir. That was fascinating. You raised an important point about politics being local, but the challenge is not only about climate change, but a lot of others being global. With your experience in politics, I was just wondering, how does one address it? Because countries around the world are facing a trust deficit, a democratic deficit.
No, we don't need to make it so complicated. It's very simple. Politicians respond to the people. This is about people caring about these issues. And that's why I spend a lot of my time in front of audiences telling them they need to mobilize themselves. This is affecting your life now, right? So if you speak up, if you're out in the streets, if you're talking about it, all of us as politicians will prioritize it. No. All the manifestos talked about green and talked about climate change, but it has to be a higher priority. To be a higher priority, you all have to get involved. Please.
Good afternoon. I just wanted to ask you, what do you think are India's chances of achieving its net zero 2070 target? And the second question is, what kind of policy changes that you would like to see from the top to help us achieve?
So I think we'll definitely get there. And the reason we are going to get there is because technologies now are there. And the good news is that net zero is net positive. We don't need, frankly, too much from a policy point of view. We've already done a lot. Of course, there are many things more that we can do. But right now, the most important thing is we need business models that make money. And the good news is there are many business models that if we just invest in right now for the next 10 years, will make money and cut carbon emissions. So not to worry. Let's just get to work. Yes, the lady there. No, you're absolutely right. I agree with you. I am feeling a little bit of shame because I flew in from Delhi. But sometimes, you know, a little bit of carbon emissions can actually reduce a lot. So hopefully you'll make up what I did by flying in from Delhi. Thank you. Other questions? Yes.
Thank you very much for the excellent presentation. I'm a postdoctoral researcher in physics in this university, and I work on perovskite photovoltaics, what the professor mentioned is one of the new technologies for solarization. And I see a lot of efforts being made in India for solarizing homes, Make in India, manufacturing. But what I fail to see is, you mentioned about China, right? So there's a lot of trust in manufacturing, but in India, when are we going to put our trust in inventing, not only make in India, but research in India, invent in India?
Why don't you come to India and invent? So the answer, look, we can't always be pointing fingers at others. This is one of those situations where we individually have to take responsibility in terms of our actions and in terms of the kinds of businesses and efforts that we undertake. It really is incumbent upon us. So be the change you want to see. We all have to play a role in this. There is a lot happening. It's not that there's not a lot happening. There's a tremendous amount already happening in India. Certainly, we have challenges when it comes to manufacturing competitiveness against other countries, but the government is seized of the matter. We are taking many important policy steps. But most importantly, we need our entrepreneurs, our scientists, our inventors to really, really participate in all of this. And if all of you do it, I'm sure we can make tremendous progress. But again, remember, we already have enough there for the next 10 years that's ready to go. We just have to put our shoulder to the wheel, develop these business models and accelerate their scaling up. Yes, please.
So, of course, huge believer of this. And to the extent, I'm an institutional investor out of Dubai. We are putting a climate fund in India. But very recently, I read the news, and I'm sure you also you must have read, US funds had the worst ever quarter on ESG product. With all this, such a gravity of situation, how a common person should relate to this? That is it a fad? Is it something? Because on one hand, we are talking about this gravity, and on the other hand, countries like US, which are considered to be sort of our leaders in this.
No, that's a great question. But I don't believe that we've got to think of this as ESG. So ESG becomes something that people feel like, okay, we have to lower returns or take on more risk to be able to do something that is good for society. No, make money. I want you to go out and invest in a $1 trillion company. I actually happen to believe from a business point of view, and I say this as an investor, I think green companies are going to do incredibly well and make a lot of money. So that's why let's not treat it as an ESG opportunity. Let's treat it as a legitimate, massive business opportunity. And the moment we get the best brains and the best talent to work on it, we will create those trillion-dollar companies that will do carbon capture, that will create new battery chemistries, that will find new biofuels. It'll happen. We just have to put our ingenuity to work. If we can solve a problem like artificial intelligence, which is such a hard problem, you heard, Rohan Murthy talk about it. Why can't we solve these problems? I'm an engineer. I think it's solvable.
Thank you, Minister, sir, for the presentation. I sort of approach, as a climate finance professional myself, I approach it slightly differently. While I think we're on the same page that adaptation, climate transition will largely be addressed with the financing that is coming and continuing to move through. But don't you think the policy today in India is quite silent on mitigation, on adaptation measures and ensuring that any of the damages you've seen, floods in Himachal Pradesh, for example, and the heat temperatures that you talked about, we're not hearing not much on strategy in that respect. And how do you make sure that you have financial models to address real climate adaptation issues, which will address a larger population, in my opinion, than transition efforts in the aspects that you talked about?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. Much of what I have talked about is actually mitigation, that is decarbonization, particularly in the private sector. That's largely what I have spoken about. You brought up a different set of issues, which is adaptation with government support, and that is public finance. That's a very difficult and complicated set of problems. Of course, there's a lot of effort underway there as well, but it's not going as fast and as well as we would like. A lot of the social security programs that are in India right now, a Narega, for example, or the Kisan Samman Nidhi, which is to provide 6,000 rupees a year to farmers, a lot of that effectively